Part 3, Contributions to Therapy. Chapter 6, To Be and Not to Be. The fundamental contribution of existential therapy is its understanding of man as being. It does not deny the validity of dynamisms and the study of specific behavior patterns in their rightful places. But it holds that drives or dynamisms, by whatever name one calls them, can be understood only in the context of the structure of the existence of the person we are dealing with. The distinctive character of existential analysis is, thus, that it is concerned with ontology, the science of being, and with Dasein, the existence of this particular being sitting opposite the psychotherapist. Before struggling with definitions of being and related terms, let us begin existentially by reminding ourselves that what we are talking about is an experience every sensitive therapist must have countless times a day. It is the experience of the instantaneous encounter with another person who comes alive to us on a very different level from what we know about him. Instantaneous refers not to the actual time involved, but to the quality of the experience. We may know a great deal about a patient from his case record, let us say, and may have a fairly good idea of how other interviewers have described him. But when the patient himself steps in, we often have a sudden, sometimes powerful, experience of, here is a new person, an experience that normally carries with it an element of surprise. Not in the sense of perplexity or bewilderment, but in its etymological sense of being taken from above. This is in no sense a criticism of one's colleagues' reports, for we have this experience of encounter even with persons we have known or worked with for a long time. We may have it with friends and loved ones. It is not a once-and-for-all experience. Indeed, in any developing, growing relationship, it may, probably should, if the relationship is vital, occur continually. The data we learned about the patient may have been accurate and well worth learning, but the point, rather, is that the grasping of the being of the other person occurs on a different level from our knowledge of specific things about him. Obviously, a knowledge of the drives and mechanisms which are in operation in the other person's behavior is useful. A familiarity with his patterns of interpersonal relationships is highly relevant. Information about his social conditioning, the meaning of particular gestures and symbolic actions is to the point, and so on ad infinitum. But all these fall on a different level when we confront the overarching, most real fact of all, namely, the immediate living person himself. When we find that all our voluminous knowledge about the person suddenly forms itself into a new pattern in this confrontation, the implication is not that the knowledge was wrong, it is rather that it takes its meaning, form, and significance from the reality of the person of whom these specific things are expressions. Nothing we are saying here in the slightest deprecates the importance of gathering and studying seriously all the specific data one can get about the given person. This is only common sense, but neither can one close his eyes to the experiential fact that these data form themselves into a configuration given in the encounter with the person himself. This also is illustrated by the common experience we all have had in interviewing persons. We may say we do not get a feeling of the other person and need to prolong the interview until the data break into their own form in our minds. We particularly do not get this feeling when we ourselves are hostile or resent the relationship, that is, keep the other person out, no matter how intellectually bright we may be at the time. This is the classical distinction between knowing and knowing about. When we seek to know a person, the knowledge about him must be subordinated to the overarching fact of his actual existence. In the ancient Greek and Hebrew languages, the verb to know is the same word as that which means to have sexual intercourse. This is illustrated time and again in the King James translation of the Bible, quote, "Abraham knew his wife and she conceived," end quote. To know had the same meaning in 16th and 17th century English. Thus, the etymological relation between knowing and loving is exceedingly close. Knowing another human being, like loving him, involves a kind of union, a dialectical participation with the other. This Binswanger calls the dual mode. One must have at least a readiness to love the other person, broadly speaking, if one is to be able to understand him. The encounter with the being of another person has the power to shake one profoundly and may potentially be very anxiety-arousing. It may also be joy-creating. In either case, it has the power to grasp and move one deeply. The therapist understandably may be tempted for his own comfort to abstract himself from the encounter by thinking of the other as just a patient, or by focusing only on certain mechanisms of behavior. But if the technical view is used dominantly in the relating to the other person, obviously one has defended oneself from anxiety at the price not only of the isolation of oneself from the other, but also of radical distortion of reality. For one does not then really see the other person. It does not disparage the importance of technique to point out that technique, like data, must be subordinated to the fact of the reality of two persons in the room. This point has been admirably made in a slightly different way by Sartre. If we consider man, he writes, quote, as capable of being analyzed and reduced to original data, to determined drives or desires supported by the subject as properties of an object, end quote, we may indeed end up with an imposing system of substances which we may then call mechanisms or dynamisms or patterns. But we find ourselves up against a dilemma. Our human being has become, quote, a sort of indeterminate clay, which would have to receive the desires passively, or he would be reduced to a simple bundle of these irreducible drives or tendencies. In either case, the man disappears. We can no longer find the one to whom this or that experience has happened, end quote. It is difficult enough to give definitions of being and Dasein, but our task is made doubly difficult by the fact that these terms and their connotations encounter much resistance. Some readers may feel that these words are only a new form of mysticism, used in its disparaging and quite inaccurate sense of misty, and have nothing to do with science. But this attitude obviously dodges the whole issue by disparaging it. It is interesting that the term mystic is used in this derogatory sense to mean anything we cannot segmentize and count. The odd belief prevails in our culture that a thing or experience is not real if we cannot make it mathematical, and somehow it must be real if we can reduce it to numbers. But this means making an abstraction out of it. Mathematics is the abstraction par excellence, which is indeed its glory and the reason for its great usefulness. Modern Western man thus finds himself in the strange situation, after reducing something to an abstraction, of having then to persuade himself it is real. This has much to do with the sense of isolation and loneliness which is endemic in the modern Western world, for the only experience we let ourselves believe in as real is that which precisely is not. Thus we deny the reality of our own experience. The term mystic, in this disparaging sense, is generally used in the service of obscurantism. Certainly avoiding an issue by derogation is only to obscure it. Is not the scientific attitude rather to try to see clearly what it is we are talking about and then to find whatever terms or symbols can best, with least distortion, describe this reality? It should not so greatly surprise us to find that being belongs to that class of realities like love and consciousness, for two other examples, which we cannot segmentize or abstract without losing precisely what we set out to study. This does not, however, relieve us from the task of trying to understand and describe them. A more serious source of resistance is one that runs through the whole of modern Western society, namely the psychological need to avoid and, in some ways, repress the whole concern with being. In contrast to other cultures which may be very concerned with being, particularly Indian and East Asian, and other historical periods which have been so concerned, the characteristic of our period in the West, as Marcel rightly phrases it, is precisely that the awareness of, quote, the sense of the ontological, the sense of being, is lacking. Generally speaking, modern man is in this condition. If ontological demands worry him at all, it is only dully, as an obscure impulse. End quote. Marcel points out what many students have emphasized, that this loss of the sense of being is related on one hand to our tendency to subordinate existence to function. A man knows himself not as a man or self, but as a token seller in the subway, a grocer, a professor, a vice president of AT&T, or by whatever his economic function may be. And on the other hand, this loss of the sense of being is related to the mass collectivist trends and widespread conformist tendencies in our culture. Marcel then makes this trenchant challenge, quote, "Indeed, I wonder if a psychoanalytic method, deeper and more discerning than any that has been evolved until now, would not reveal the morbid effects of the repression of this sense and the ignoring of this need." End quote. Quote, "As for defining the word being," Marcel goes on, "let us admit that it is extremely difficult. I would merely suggest this method of approach. Being is what withstands, or what would withstand, an exhaustive analysis bearing on the data of experience and aiming to reduce them step by step to elements increasingly devoid of intrinsic or significant value. An analysis of this kind is attempted in the theoretical works of Freud." End quote. This last sentence I take to mean that when Freud's analysis is pushed to the ultimate extreme, and we know, let us say, everything about drives, instincts, and mechanisms, we have everything except being. Being is that which remains. It is that which constitutes this infinitely complex set of deterministic factors into a person to whom the experiences happen, and who possesses some element, no matter how minute, of freedom to become aware that these forces are acting upon him. This is the sphere where he has the potential capacity to pause before reacting, and thus to cast some weight on whether his reaction will go this way or that. And this, therefore, is the sphere where he, the human being, is never merely a collection of drives and determined forms of behavior. The term the existential therapists use for the distinctive character of human existence is Dasein. Binswanger, Kuhn, and others designate their schools as Daseinsanalyse, composed of sein, being, plus da, there. Dasein indicates that man is the being who is there, and implies also that he has a there in the sense that he can know he is there and can take a stand with reference to that fact. The there is moreover not just any place, but the particular there that is mine, the particular point in time as well as space of my existence at this given moment. Man is the being who can be conscious of, and therefore responsible for, his existence. It is this capacity to become aware of his own being which distinguishes the human being from other beings. The existential therapists think of man not only as being in itself, as all beings are, but also as being for itself. Binswanger speaks of Dasein choosing, this or that. Binswanger speaks of Dasein choosing this or that, meaning the person who is responsible for his existence choosing. The full meaning of the term human being will be clearer if the reader will keep in mind that being is a participle, a verb form implying that someone is in the process of being something. It is unfortunate that, when used as a general noun in English, the term being connotes a static substance, and when used as a particular noun such as a being, it is usually assumed to refer to an entity, say, such as a soldier to be counted as a unit. Rather, being should be understood when used as a general noun to mean potentia, the source of potentiality. Being is the potentiality by which the acorn becomes the oak, or each of us becomes what he truly is. and when used in a particular sense, such as a human being, it always has the dynamic connotation of someone in process, the person being something. Perhaps, therefore, becoming connotes more accurately the meaning of the term in this country, despite the difficulties with the term we have mentioned earlier. We can understand another human being only as we see what he is moving toward, what he is becoming, and we can know ourselves only as we project our potentia in action. The significant tense for human beings is thus the future. That is to say, the critical question is what I am pointing toward, what I will be in the immediate future. Thus, being in the human sense is not given once and for all. It does not unfold automatically as the oak tree does from the acorn. For an intrinsic and inseparable element in being human is self-consciousness. Man, or Dasein, is the particular being who has to be aware of himself, be responsible for himself, if he is to become himself. He also is that particular being who knows that at some future moment he will not be. He is the being who is always in a dialectical relation with non-being, death, and he not only knows he will sometime not be, but he can, in his own choices, slough off and forfeit his being. Quote, to be and not to be, end quote. The "and" in our title to this chapter is not a typographical error, is not a choice one makes once and for all at the point of considering suicide. It reflects to some degree a choice made at every instant. The profound dialectic in the human being's awareness of his own being is pictured with incomparable beauty by Pascal. Quote, man is only a reed, the feeblest reed in nature, but he is a thinking reed. There is no need for the entire universe to arm itself in order to annihilate him. A vapor, a drop of water, suffices to kill him. But were the universe to crush him, man would yet be more noble than that which slays him, because he knows that he dies, and the advantage that the universe has over him, of this the universe knows nothing. End quote. In the hope of making clearer what it means for a person to experience his own being, we shall present an illustration from a case history. This patient, an intelligent woman of 28, was especially gifted in expressing what was occurring within her. She had come for psychotherapy because of serious anxiety spells in closed places, severe self-doubts, and eruptions of rage which were sometimes uncontrollable. An illegitimate child, she had been brought up by relatives in a small village in the southwestern part of the country. Her mother, in periods of anger, often reminded her as a child of her origin, recounted how she had tried to abort her, and in times of trouble had shouted at the little girl, "If you hadn't been born, we wouldn't have to go through this." Other relatives had cried at the child, in family quarrels, "Why didn't you kill yourself?" and "You should have been choked the day you were born." Later, as a young woman, the patient had become well educated on her own initiative. In the 4th month of therapy, she had the following dream. Quote, I was in a crowd of people. They had no faces. They were like shadows. It seemed like a wilderness of people. Then I saw there was someone in the crowd who had compassion for me. End quote. The next session she reported that she had had, in the intervening day, an exceedingly important experience. It is reported here as she wrote it down from memory and notes 2 years later. Quote, I remember walking that day under the elevated tracks in a slum area, feeling the thought, I am an illegitimate child. I recall the sweat pouring forth in my anguish in trying to accept that fact. Then I understood what it must feel like to accept I am a in the midst of privileged whites, or I am blind in the midst of people who see. Later on that night, I woke up and it came to me this way. I accept the fact that I am an illegitimate child, but I am not a child anymore, so it is, I am illegitimate. That is not so either. I was born illegitimate. Then what is left? What is left is this: I am. This act of contact and acceptance with I am, once gotten hold of, gave me what I think was for me the first time, the experience: since I am, I have the right to be. What is this experience like? It is a primary feeling. It feels like receiving the deed to my house. It is the experience of my own aliveness, not caring whether it turns out to be an ion or just a wave. It is like when a very young child I once reached the core of a peach and cracked the pit, not knowing what I would find, and then feeling the wonder of finding the inner seed. Good to eat in its bitter sweetness. It is like a sailboat in the harbor being given an anchor so that, being made out of earthly things, it can by means of its anchor get in touch again with the earth, the ground from which its wood grew. It can lift its anchor to sail, but always at times it can cast its anchor to weather the storm or rest a little. It is my saying to Descartes, I am, therefore I think, I feel, I do. It is like an axiom in geometry. Never experiencing it would be like going through a geometry course not knowing the first axiom. It is like going into my very own Garden of Eden, where I am beyond good and evil and all other human concepts. It is like the experience of the poets of the intuitive world, the mystics, except that instead of the pure feeling of and union with God, it is the finding of and the union with my own being. It is like owning Cinderella's shoe and looking all over the world for the foot it will fit, and realizing all of a sudden that one's own foot is the only one it will fit. It is a matter of fact in the etymological sense of the expression. It is like a globe before the mountains and oceans and continents have been drawn on it. It is like a child in grammar finding the subject of the verb in a sentence, in this case, the subject being one's own lifespan. It is ceasing to feel like a theory towards oneself. End quote. We shall call this the I am experience. This one phase of a complex case, powerfully and beautifully described above, illustrates the emergence and strengthening of the sense of being in one person. The experience is etched the more sharply in this person because of the more patent threat to her being that she had suffered as an illegitimate child, and her poetic articulateness as she looked back on her experience from the vantage point of 2 years later. I do not believe either of these facts, however, makes her experience different in fundamental quality from what human beings in general, normal or neurotic, go through. We shall make 4 final comments on the experience exemplified in this case. First, the I am experience is not in itself the solution to a person's problems. It is rather the precondition for their solution. This patient spent some 2 years thereafter working through specific psychological problems, which she was able to do on the basis of this emerged experience of her own existence. In the broadest sense, the achieving of the sense of being is a goal of all therapy, but in the more precise sense, it is a relation to oneself and one's world, an experience of one's own existence, including one's own identity, which is a prerequisite for the working through of specific problems. It is, as the patient wrote, the primary fact, a your experience. It is not to be identified with any patient's discovery of his specific powers. When he learns, let us say, that he can paint or write or work successfully or have successful sexual intercourse. Viewed from the outside, the discovery of specific powers and the experience of one's own being may seem to go hand in hand, but the latter is the underpinning, the foundation, the psychological precondition of the former. We may well be suspicious that solutions to a person's specific problems in psychotherapy which do not presuppose this I am experience in greater or lesser degree will have a pseudo-quality. The new powers the patient discovers may well be experienced by him as merely compensatory, that is, as proofs that he is of significance despite the fact that he is certain on a deeper level that he is not, since he still lacks a basic conviction of I am, therefore I think I act. And we could well wonder whether such compensatory solutions would not represent rather the patient simply exchanging one defense system for another, one set of terms for another, without ever experiencing himself as alive, significant, and existing. In the second state, the patient, instead of blowing up in anger, sublimates or introverts or relates, but still without the act being rooted in his own existence. Our second comment is that this patient's I am experience is not to be explained by the transference relationship, that the positive transference, whether directed to therapist or husband, is obviously present in the above case is shown in the eloquent dream the night before, in which there was one person in the depersonalized wilderness of the crowd. I assume that this is myself, the therapist, who had compassion for her. True, she is showing in the dream that she could have the I am experience only if she could trust some other human being. But this does not account for the experience itself. It may well be true that for any human being the possibility of acceptance by and trust for another human being is a necessary condition for the I am experience. But the awareness of one's own being occurs basically on the level of the grasping of oneself. It is an experience of Dasein, realized in the realm of self-awareness. It is not to be explained essentially in social categories. The acceptance by another person, such as the therapist, shows the patient that he no longer needs to fight his main battle on the front of whether anyone else or the world can accept him. The acceptance frees him to experience his own being. This point must be emphasized because of the common error in many circles of assuming that the experience of one's own being will be discovered automatically if only one is accepted by somebody else. This is the basic error of some forms of relationship therapy. The attitude of, if I love and accept you, this is all you need, is in life and in therapy an attitude which may well minister to increased passivity. The crucial question is what the individual himself, in his own awareness of and responsibility for his existence, does with the fact that he can be accepted. The third comment follows directly from above, that being is a category which cannot be reduced to introjection of social and ethical norms. It is, to use Nietzsche's phrase, beyond good and evil. To the extent that my sense of existence is authentic, it is precisely not what others have told me I should be, but is the one Archimedes point I have to stand on from which to judge what parents and other authorities demand. Indeed, compulsive and rigid moralism arises in given persons precisely as the result of a lack of a sense of being. Rigid moralism is a compensatory mechanism by which the individual persuades himself to take over the external sanctions, because he has no fundamental assurance that his own choices have any sanction of their own. This is not to deny the vast social influences in anyone's morality, but it is to say that the ontological sense cannot be wholly reduced to such influences. The ontological sense is not a superego phenomenon. By the same token, the sense of being gives the person a basis for a self-esteem which is not merely the reflection of others' views about him. For if your self-esteem must rest in the long run on social validation, you have not self-esteem but a more sophisticated form of social conformity. It cannot be said too strongly that the sense of one's own existence, though interwoven with all kinds of social relatedness, is in basis not the product of social forces. It always presupposes Eigenwelt, the own world, a term which will be discussed below. Our fourth comment deals with the most important consideration of all, namely, that the I am experience must not be identified with what is called in various circles the functioning of the ego. That is to say, it is an error to define the emergence of awareness of one's own being as one phase of the development of the ego. We need only reflect on what the concept of ego has meant in classical psychoanalytic tradition to see why this is so. The ego was traditionally conceived as a relatively weak, shadowy, passive, and derived agent, largely an epiphenomenon of other more powerful processes. It is, quote, derived from the id by modifications imposed on it from the external world, end quote, and is, quote, representative of the external world, end quote. Quote, what we call the ego is essentially passive, says Grodek, a statement which Freud cites with approval. The development in the middle period of psychoanalytic theory brought increased emphasis on the ego, to be sure, but chiefly as an aspect of the study of defense mechanisms. The ego enlarged its originally buffeted and frail realm chiefly by its negative defensive functions. It, quote, owes service to three masters and is consequently menaced by three dangers: the external world, the libido of the id, the severity of the superego, end quote. Freud often remarked that the ego does very well indeed if it can preserve some semblance of harmony in its unruly house. A moment's thought will show how great is the difference between this ego and the I am experience, the sense of being which we have been discussing. The latter occurs on a more fundamental level and is a precondition for ego development. The ego is a part of the personality, and traditionally a relatively weak part, whereas the sense of being refers to one's whole experience, unconscious as well as conscious, and is by no means merely the agent of awareness. The ego is a reflection of the outside world. The sense of being is rooted in one's own experience of existence, and if it is a mirroring of, a reflection of, the outside world alone, it is then precisely not one's own sense of existence. My sense of being is not my capacity to see the outside world, to size it up, to assess reality. It is rather my capacity to see myself as a being in the world, to know myself as the being who can do these things. It is in this sense a precondition for what is called ego development. The ego is the subject in the subject-object relationship. The sense of being occurs on a level prior to this dichotomy. Being means not I am the subject, but I am the being who can, among other things, know myself as the subject of what is occurring. The sense of being is not in origin set against the outside world, but it must include this capacity to set oneself against the external world if necessary, just as it must include the capacity to confront non-being. To be sure, both what is called the ego and the sense of being presuppose the emergence of self-awareness in the child somewhere between the first couple of months of infancy and the age of 2 years, a developmental process often called the emergence of the ego. But this does not mean these two should be identified. The ego is said normally to be especially weak in childhood, weak in proportion to the child's relatively weak assessment of and relation to reality, whereas the sense of being may be especially strong, only later to diminish as the child learns to give himself over to conformist tendencies, to experience his existence as a reflection of others' evaluation of him, to lose some of his originality and primary sense of being. Actually, the sense of being, that is, the ontological sense, is presupposed for ego development, just as it is presupposed for the solution of other problems. We are aware that additions and elaborations are occurring in ego theory of late decades in the orthodox psychoanalytic tradition, but one cannot strengthen such a weak monarch by decking him out in additional robes, no matter how well woven or intricately tailored the robes may be. The real and fundamental trouble with the doctrine of the ego is that it represents, par excellence, the subject-object dichotomy in modern thought. Indeed, it is necessary to emphasize that the very fact that the ego is conceived of as weak, passive, and derived is itself an evidence and a symptom of the loss of the sense of being in our day, a symptom of the repression of the ontological concern. This view of the ego is a symbol of the pervasive tendency to see the human being primarily as a passive recipient of forces acting upon him, whether the forces be identified as the id or the vast industrial juggernaut in Marxian terms, or the submersion of the individual as one among many in the sea of conformity in Heidegger's terms. The view of the ego as relatively weak and buffeted about by the id was in Freud a profound symbol of the fragmentation of man in the Victorian period and also a strong corrective to the superficial voluntarism of that day. But the error arises when the ego is elaborated as the basic norm. The sense of being, the ontological awareness, must be assumed below ego theory if that theory is to refer with self-consistency to the human being as human. We now come to the important problem of non-being, or, as phrased in existential literature, nothingness. The "and" in the title of this chapter, "to be and not to be," expresses the fact that non-being is an inseparable part of being. To grasp what it means to exist, one needs to grasp the fact that he might not exist, that he treads at every moment on the sharp edge of possible annihilation and can never escape the fact that death will arrive at some unknown moment in the future. Existence, never automatic, not only can be sloughed off and forfeited, but is indeed at every instant threatened by non-being. Without this awareness of non-being, that is, awareness of the threats to one's being in death, anxiety, and the less dramatic but persistent threats of loss of potentialities in conformism, existence is vapid, unreal, and characterized by lack of concrete self-awareness. But with the confronting of non-being, existence takes on vitality and immediacy, and the individual experiences a heightened consciousness of himself, his world, and others around him. Death is the most obvious form of the threat of non-being. Freud grasped this truth on one level in his symbol of the death instinct. Life forces, being, are arrayed at every moment, he held, against the forces of death, non-being. And in every individual life, the latter will ultimately triumph. But Freud's concept of the death instinct is an ontological truth and should not be taken as a deteriorated psychological theory. The concept of the death instinct is an excellent example of the point that Freud went beyond technical reason and tried to keep open the tragic dimension of life. His emphasis on the inevitability of hostility, aggression, and self-destructiveness in existence also, from one standpoint, has this meaning. True, he phrased these concepts wrong, as when he interpreted the death instinct in chemical terms. The use of the word thanatos in psychoanalytic circles as parallel to libido is an example of this deteriorated phraseology. These are errors which arise from trying to put ontological truths, which death and tragedy are, into the frame of technical reason and reduce them to specific psychological mechanisms. On that basis, Horney and others could logically argue that Freud was too pessimistic, and that he merely rationalized war and aggression. I think that is a sound argument against the usual oversimplified psychoanalytic interpretations, which are in the form of technical reason. But it is not a sound argument against Freud himself, who tried to preserve a real concept of tragedy, ambivalent though his frame of reference was. He had indeed a sense of non-being, despite the fact that he always tried to subordinate it and his concept of being to technical reason. It is also an error to see the death instinct only in biological terms, which would leave us hobbled with a fatalism. The unique and crucial fact, rather, is that the human being is the one who knows he is going to die, who anticipates his own death. The critical question, thus, is how he relates to the fact of death, whether he spends his existence running away from death or making a cult of repressing the recognition of death under the rationalizations of beliefs in automatic progress or providence, as is the habit of our Western society, or obscuring it by saying one dies and turning it into a matter of public statistics which serve to cover over the one ultimately important fact that he himself at some unknown future moment will die. The existential analysts, on the other hand, hold that the confronting of death gives the most positive reality to life itself. It makes the individual existence real, absolute, and concrete. For death as an irrelative potentiality singles man out and, as it were, individualizes him to make him understand the potentiality of being in others, as well as himself, when he realizes the inescapable nature of his own death. Death is, in other words, the one fact of my life which is not relative but absolute, and my awareness of this gives my existence and what I do each hour an absolute quality. Nor do we need to go as far as the extreme example of death to discover the problem of non-being. Perhaps the most ubiquitous and ever-present form of the failure to confront non-being in our day is in conformism, the tendency of the individual to let himself be absorbed in the sea of collective responses and attitudes, to become swallowed up in das Man, with the corresponding loss of his own awareness, potentialities, and whatever characterizes him as a unique and original being. The individual temporarily escapes the anxiety of non-being by this means, but at the price of forfeiting his own powers and sense of existence. On the positive side, the capacity to confront non-being is illustrated in one's ability to accept anxiety, hostility, and aggression. By accept, we mean here to tolerate without repression and so far as possible to utilize constructively. Severe anxiety, hostility, and aggression are states and ways of relating to oneself and others which would curtail or destroy being. But to preserve one's existence by running away from situations which would produce anxiety or situations of potential hostility and aggression leaves one with the vapid, weak, unreal sense of being, what Nietzsche meant in his brilliant description of the impotent people, who evade their aggression by repressing it, and thereupon experience drugged tranquility and free-floating resentment. Our point does not at all imply the sloughing over of the distinction between the neurotic and normal forms of anxiety, hostility, and aggression. Obviously, the one constructive way to confront neurotic anxiety, hostility, and aggression is to clarify them psychotherapeutically and so far as possible to wipe them out. But that task has been made doubly difficult and the whole problem confused by our failure to see the normal forms of these states, normal in the sense that they inhere in the threat of non-being with which all beings have to cope. Indeed, is it not clear that neurotic forms of anxiety, hostility, and aggression develop precisely because the individual has been unable to accept and deal with the normal forms of these states and ways of behaving? Paul Tillich has suggested far-reaching implications for the therapeutic process in his powerful sentence, which we shall quote without attempting to elucidate. Quote, "The self-affirmation of a being is the stronger the more non-being it can take into itself." End quote. Chapter 7. Anxiety and Guilt as Ontological. Our discussion of being and non-being now leads to the point where we can understand the fundamental nature of anxiety. Anxiety is not an affect among other affects, such as pleasure or sadness. It is rather an ontological characteristic of man, rooted in his very existence as such. It is not a peripheral threat which I can take or leave, for example, or a reaction which may be classified beside other reactions. It is always a threat to the foundation, the center of my existence. Anxiety is the experience of the threat of imminent non-being. In his classical contributions to the understanding of anxiety, Kurt Goldstein has emphasized that anxiety is not something we have, but something we are. His vivid descriptions of anxiety at the onset of psychosis, when the patient is literally experiencing the threat of dissolution of the self, make his point abundantly clear. But, as he himself insists, this threat of dissolution of the self is not merely something confined to psychotics, but describes the neurotic and normal nature of anxiety as well. Anxiety is the subjective state of the individual's becoming aware that his existence can become destroyed, that he can lose himself and his world, that he can become nothing. This understanding of anxiety as ontological illuminates the difference between anxiety and fear. The distinction is not one of degree nor of the intensity of the experience. The anxiety a person feels when someone he respects passes him on the street without speaking, for example, is not as intense as the fear he experiences when the dentist seizes the drill to attack a sensitive tooth. But the gnawing threat of the slight on the street may hound him all day long and torment his dreams at night, whereas the feeling of fear, though it was quantitatively greater, is gone for the time being as soon as he steps out of the dentist's chair. The difference is that the anxiety strikes at the central core of his self-esteem and his sense of value as a self, which is the most important aspect of his experience of himself as a being. Fear, in contrast, is a threat to the periphery of his existence. It can be objectivated, and the person can stand outside and look at it. In greater or lesser degree, anxiety overwhelms the person's discovery of being, blots out the sense of time, dulls the memory of the past, and erases the future, which is perhaps the most compelling proof of the fact that it attacks the center of one's being. While we are subject to anxiety, we are to that extent unable to conceive in imagination how existence would be outside the anxiety. This is why anxiety is so hard to bear, and why people will choose, if they have the chance, severe physical pain which would appear to the outside observer much worse. Anxiety is ontological, fear is not. Fear can be studied as an affect among other affects, a reaction among other reactions, but anxiety can be understood only as a threat to being itself. This understanding of anxiety as an ontological characteristic again highlights our difficulty with words. The term which Freud, Binswanger, Goldstein, Kierkegaard, as he is translated into German, use for anxiety is angst, a word for which there is no English equivalent. It is first cousin to anguish, which comes from Latin angustus, narrow, which in turn comes from anger, to pain by pushing together or to choke. The English term anxiety, such as in I am anxious to do this or that, is a much weaker word. Hence, some students translate angst as dread, as did Lowry in his now outdated translations of Kierkegaard. Some of us have tried to preserve the term anxiety for angst, but we were caught in a dilemma. It seemed the alternative was either to use anxiety as a watered-down affect among other affects, which will work scientifically, but at the price of the loss of power of the word, or to use such a term as dread, which carries literary power but has no role as a scientific category. Hence, so often, laboratory experiments on anxiety have seemed to fall woefully short of dealing with the power and devastating qualities of anxiety, which we observe every day in clinical work, and also even clinical discussions about neurotic symptoms and psychotic conditions seem often to coast along the surface of the problem. The upshot of the existential understanding of anxiety is to give the term back its original power. It is an experience of threat which carries both anguish and dread. indeed the most painful and basic threat which any being can suffer, for it is the threat of loss of being itself. In my judgment, our psychological and psychiatrical dealings with anxiety phenomena of all sorts will be greatly helped by shifting the concept to its ontological base. Another significant aspect of anxiety may now also be seen more clearly, namely, the fact that anxiety always involves inner conflict. Is not this conflict precisely between what we have called being and non-being? Anxiety occurs at the point where some emerging potentiality or possibility faces the individual, some possibility of fulfilling his existence, but this very possibility involves the destroying of present security, which thereupon gives rise to the tendency to deny the new potentiality. Here lies the truth of the symbol of the birth trauma as the prototype of all anxiety, an interpretation suggested by the etymological source of the word anxiety as pain in narrows, choking, as though through the straits of being born. This interpretation of anxiety as birth trauma was, as is well known, held by Rank to cover all anxiety and was agreed to by Freud on a less comprehensive basis. There is no doubt that it carries an important symbolic truth even if one does not take it as connected with the literal birth of the infant. If there were not some possibility of opening up, some potentiality crying to be born, we would not experience anxiety. This is why anxiety is so profoundly connected with the problem of freedom. If the individual did not have some freedom, no matter how minute, to fulfill some new potentiality, he would not experience anxiety. Kierkegaard described anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, and added more explicitly, if not more clearly, quote, anxiety is the reality of freedom as a potentiality before this freedom has materialized, end quote. Goldstein illustrates this by pointing out how some people individually and collectively surrender freedom in the hope of getting rid of unbearable anxiety. Citing the individuals retreating behind the rigid stockade of dogma or whole groups collectively turning to fascism in the interwar years in Europe. In whatever way one chooses to illustrate it, this discussion points to the positive aspect of angst, for the experience of anxiety itself demonstrates that some potentiality is present, some new possibility of being, threatened by non-being. We have stated that the condition of the individual when confronted with the issue of fulfilling his potentialities is anxiety. We now move on to state that when the person denies these potentialities, fails to fulfill them, his condition is guilt. That is to say, guilt is also an ontological characteristic of human existence. This can be no better illustrated than to summarize a case Medard Boss cites of a severe obsessional compulsive, which he treated. This patient, a physician suffering from washing, cleaning compulsions, had gone through both Freudian and Jungian analyses. He had had for some time a recurrent dream involving church steeples, which had been interpreted in the Freudian analysis in terms of phallic symbols and in the Jungian in terms of religious archetype symbols. The patient could discuss these interpretations intelligently and at length, but his neurotic compulsive behavior, after temporary abeyance, continued as crippling as ever. During the first months of his analysis with Boss, the patient reported a recurrent dream in which he would approach a lavatory door which would always be locked. Boss confined himself to asking each time only why the door needed to be locked, to rattling the doorknob, as he put it. Finally, the patient had a dream in which he went through the door and found himself inside a church, waist-deep in feces, and being tugged by a rope wrapped around his waist, leading up to the bell tower. The patient was suspended in such tension that he thought he would be pulled to pieces. He then went through a psychotic episode of 4 days during which Boss remained by his bedside, after which the analysis continued with an eventual very successful outcome. Boss points out in his discussion of this case that the patient was guilty because he had locked up some essential potentialities in himself. Therefore, he had guilt feelings. If, as Boss puts it, we forget being by failing to bring ourselves to our entire being, by failing to be authentic, by slipping into the conformist anonymity of das Man, then we have in fact missed our being and to that extent our failures. Quote, if you lock up potentialities you are guilty against, or indebted to, as the German word may be translated, what is given to you in your origin, in your core. In this existential condition of being indebted and being guilty are founded all guilt feelings, in whatever 1,001 concrete forms and malformations they appear in actuality. End quote. This is what had happened to the patient. He had locked up both the bodily and the spiritual possibilities of experience, the drive aspect and the God aspect, as Boss also phrases it. The patient had previously accepted the libido and archetype explanations and knew them all too well, but that is a good way, says Boss, to escape the whole thing. Because the patient did not accept and take into his existence these two aspects, he was guilty, indebted to himself. This was the origin, alas, of his neurosis and psychosis. The patient, in a letter to Boss sometime after the treatment, pointed out that the reason he could not really accept his anality in his first analysis was that he sensed the ground was not fully developed in the analyst himself. The analyst had always attempted to reduce the dream of the church steeple to genital symbols, and the, quote, whole weight of the holy appeared to him as a mere sublimation mist, end quote. By the same token, the archetypal explanation, also symbolic, never could be integrated with the bodily, and for that matter never did really mesh with the religious experience either. Let us note well that Boss says the patient is guilty, not merely that he has guilt feelings. This is a radical statement with far-reaching implications. It is an existential approach which cuts through the dense fog which has obscured much of the psychological discussion of guilt. Discussions that have proceeded on the assumption that we can deal only with some vague guilt feelings, as though it did not matter whether guilt was real or not. Has not this reduction of guilt to mere guilt feelings contributed considerably to the lack of reality and the sense of illusion in much psychotherapy? Has it not also tended to confirm the patient's neurosis in that it implicitly opens the way for him not to take his guilt seriously and to make peace with the fact that he has indeed forfeited his own being? Boss's approach is radically existential in that it takes the real phenomena with respect, here the real phenomenon being guilt. Nor is the guilt exclusively linked up with the religious aspect of this or any patient's experience. We can be as guilty by refusing to accept the anal, genital, or any other corporeal aspects of life as the intellectual or spiritual aspects. This understanding of guilt has nothing whatever to do with a judgmental attitude toward the patient. It has only to do with taking the patient's life and experience seriously and with respect. We have cited only one form of ontological guilt, namely that arising from forfeiting one's own potentialities. There are other forms as well. Another, for example, is ontological guilt against one's fellows, arising from the fact that since each of us is an individual, each necessarily perceives his fellow man through his own limited and biased eyes. This means that he always, to some extent, does violence to the true picture of his fellow man, and always, to some extent, fails fully to understand and meet the other's needs. This is not a question of moral failure or slackness, though it can indeed be greatly increased by lack of moral sensitivity. It is an inescapable result of the fact that each of us is a separate individuality and has no choice but to look at the world through his own eyes. This guilt, rooted in our existential structure, is one of the most potent sources of a sound humility and an unsentimental attitude of forgiveness towards one's fellow men. The first form of ontological guilt mentioned above, namely forfeiting of potentialities, corresponds roughly to the mode of world which we shall describe and define in Chapter 9 called Eigenwelt, or own world. The second form of guilt corresponds roughly to Mitwelt, since it is guilt chiefly related to one's fellow men. Mitwelt and Eigenwelt are also to be explained later. There is a third form of ontological guilt which involves Umwelt, as well as the other two modes, namely separation guilt in relation to nature as a whole. This is the most complex and comprehensive aspect of ontological guilt. It may seem confusing, particularly since we are unable in this outline to explicate it in detail. We include it for the sake of completeness and for the interest of those who may wish to do further research in areas of ontological guilt. This guilt with respect to our separation from nature may well be much more influential, though repressed, than we realize in our modern Western scientific age. It was originally expressed beautifully in a classical fragment from one of the early Greek philosophers of being, Anaximander. Quote, "The source of things is the boundless. From whence they rise, thence they must also of necessity return, for they do penance and make compensation to one another for their injustice in the order of time." End quote. Ontological guilt has, among others, these characteristics. First, everyone participates in it. No one of us fails to some extent to distort the reality of his fellow men, and no one fully fulfills his own potentialities. Each of us is always in a dialectical relation to his potentialities, dramatically illustrated in the dream of Boss's patient being stretched between feces and bell tower. Second, ontological guilt does not come from cultural prohibitions, or from introjection of cultural mores. It is rooted in the fact of self-awareness. Ontological guilt does not consist of "I am guilty because I violate parental prohibitions," but arises from the fact that I can see myself as the one who can choose or fail to choose. Every developed human being would have this ontological guilt, though its content would vary from culture to culture, and would largely be given by the culture. Third, ontological guilt is not to be confused with morbid or neurotic guilt. If it is unaccepted and repressed, it may turn into neurotic guilt. Just as neurotic anxiety is the end product of unfaced normal ontological anxiety, so neurotic guilt is the result of unconfronted ontological guilt. If the person can become aware of it and accept it, as Boss's patient later did, it is not morbid or neurotic. Fourth, ontological guilt does not lead to symptom formation, but has constructive effects in the personality. Specifically, it can and should lead to humility, sensitivity in one's relationships with one's fellow human beings, and increased creativity in the use of one's own potentialities. Chapter 8. Being in the World. Second only in importance to the existential therapist's search for being is their concern with the person in his world. To understand the compulsive, writes Erwin Strauss, we must first understand his world. And this is certainly true of all other types of patients as well as any human being for that matter. For being together means being together in the same world, and knowing means knowing in the context of the same world. The world of this particular patient must be grasped from the inside, be known and seen so far as possible from the angle of the one who exists in it. We psychiatrists, writes Vince Vanger, have paid far too much attention to the deviations of our patients from life in the world which is common to all, instead of focusing primarily upon the patient's own or private world, as was first systematically done by Freud." End quote. The problem is how we are to understand the other person's world. It cannot be understood as an external collection of objects which we view from the outside, in which case we never really understand it, nor by sentimental identification, in which case our understanding doesn't do any good, for we have failed to preserve the reality of our own existence. A difficult dilemma indeed. What is required is an approach to world which undercuts the cancer, namely the traditional subject-object dichotomy. The reason this endeavor to rediscover man as being in the world is so important is that it strikes directly at one of the most acute problems of modern human beings, namely that they have lost their world, lost their experience of community. Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and the existentialists who followed them perdurably pointed out that the two chief sources of modern Western man's anxiety and despair were, first, his loss of sense of being, and, second, his loss of his world. The existential analysts believe there is much evidence that these prophets were correct and that 20th century Western man not only experiences an alienation from the human world about him, but also suffers an inner, harrowing conviction of being estranged, like, say, a paroled convict, in the natural world as well. The writings from Frieda Fromm-Reichmann and Sullivan describe the state of the person who has lost his world. These authors, and others like them, illustrate how the problems of loneliness, isolation, and alienation are being increasingly dealt with in psychiatric literature. The assumption would seem likely that there is an increase not only in awareness of these problems among psychiatrists and psychologists, but also in the presence of the conditions themselves. Broadly speaking, the symptoms of isolation and alienation reflect the state of a person whose relation to the world has become broken. Some psychotherapists have pointed out that more and more patients exhibit schizoid features and that the typical kind of psychic problem in our day is not hysteria, as it was in Freud's time, but the schizoid type, that is to say, problems of persons who are detached, unrelated, lacking in affect, tending toward depersonalization, and covering up their problems by means of intellectualization and technical formulations. There is also plenty of evidence that the sense of isolation, the alienation of oneself from the world, is suffered not only by people in pathological conditions, but by countless normal persons as well in our day. Riesman presents a good deal of socio-psychological data in his study, The Lonely Crowd, to demonstrate that the isolated, lonely, alienated character type is characteristic not only of neurotic patients, but of people as a whole in our society, and that the trends in that direction have been increasing over the past couple of decades. He makes the significant point that these people have only a technical communication with their world. His outer-directed persons, the type characteristic of our day, relate to everything from its technical external side. Their orientation, for example, was not, "I liked the play," but "the play was well done," "the article well written," and so forth. Other portrayals of this condition of personal isolation and alienation in our society are given by Fromm in Escape from Freedom, particularly with respect to socio-political considerations, by Karl Marx, particularly in relation to the dehumanization arising out of the tendency in modern capitalism to value everything in the external, object-centered terms of money, and by Tillich from the spiritual viewpoint. Camus' The Stranger and Kafka's The Castle, finally, are surprisingly similar illustrations of our point. Each gives a vivid and gripping picture of a man who is a stranger in his world, a stranger to other people whom he seeks or pretends to love. He moves about in a state of homelessness, vagueness, and haze, as though he had no direct sense connection with his world, but were in a foreign country where he does not know the language and has no hope of learning it, but is always doomed to wander in quiet despair, incommunicado, homeless and a stranger. Nor is the person of this loss of world simply one of lack of interpersonal relations or lack of communication with one's fellows. Its roots reach below the social levels to an alienation from the natural world as well. It is a particular experience of isolation which has been called epistemological loneliness. Underlying the economic, sociological, and psychological aspects of alienation can be found a profound common denominator, namely the alienation which is the ultimate consequence of 4 centuries of the outworking of the separation of man as subject from the objective world. This alienation has expressed itself for several centuries in Western man's passion to gain power over nature, but now shows itself in an estrangement from nature and a vague, unarticulated, and half-suppressed sense of despair of gaining any real relationship with the natural world, including one's own body. These sentences may sound strange in this century of such apparent confidence in science, but let us examine the matter more closely. Strauss points out that Descartes, the father of modern thought, held that ego and consciousness were separated from the world and from other persons. That is to say, consciousness is cut off and stands alone. Sensations do not tell us anything directly about the outside world. They only give us inferential data. Descartes is commonly the whipping boy in these days and made to shoulder the blame for the dichotomy between subject and object. But he was only reflecting the spirit of his age and the underground tendencies in modern culture, about which he saw and wrote with beautiful clarity. The Middle Ages, Strauss goes on to say, is commonly thought of as otherworldly in contrast to the present world concerns of modern man. But actually, the medieval Christian soul was considered, while it did exist in the world, to be really related to the world. Men experienced the world about them as directly real, vid Giotto, and the body as immediate and real, vid St. Francis. Since Descartes, however, the soul and nature have had nothing to do with each other. Nature belongs exclusively to the realm of res extensa, to be understood mathematically. We know the world only indirectly, by inference. This sets the problem we have been wrestling with ever since, the full implications of which did not emerge until the last century. Strauss points out how the traditional textbooks on neurology and physiology have accepted this doctrine and have endeavored to demonstrate that what goes on neurologically has only a sign relation to the real world. Only, quote, unconscious inferences lead to the assumption of the existence of an outside world, end quote. Readers interested in this history of ideas will recall the important and imposing symbol of the same situation in Leibniz's famous doctrine that all reality consists of monads. The monads had no doors or windows opening to each other, each being separated, isolated. Quote, each single unit is lonely in itself, without any direct communication. The horror of this idea was overcome by the harmonistic presupposition that in every monad the whole world is potentially present and that the development of each individual is in a natural harmony with the development of all the others. This is the most profound metaphysical situation in the early periods of bourgeois civilization. It fitted this situation because there was still a common world, in spite of the increasing social atomization. End quote. This doctrine of pre-established harmony is a carryover of the religious idea of providence. The relation between the person and the world was somehow preordained. Descartes, in similar vein, held that God, whose existence he believed he had proved, guaranteed the relation between consciousness and the world. The socio-historical situation in the expanding phases of the modern period were such that the faith of Leibniz and Descartes worked. That is, it reflected the fact that there was still a common world. But now that God is not only dead, but a requiem has been sung over his grave, the stark isolation and alienation inherent in the relation between man and the world has become apparent. To put the matter less poetically, when the humanistic and Hebrew Christian values disintegrated along with the cultural phenomena we have discussed above, the inherent implications of the situation emerged. Thus, it is by no means accidental that modern man feels estranged from nature, that each consciousness stands off by itself, alone. This has been built into our education and to some extent even into our language. It means that the overcoming of this situation of isolation is not a simple task and requires something much more fundamental than merely the rearrangement of some of our present ideas. Let us now inquire how the existential analysts undertake to rediscover man as a being interrelated with his world and to rediscover world as meaningful to man. They hold that the person and his world are a unitary structural whole. The phrase being in the world expresses precisely that. The two poles, self and world, are always dialectically related. Self implies world and world self. There is neither without the other, and each is understandable only in terms of the other. It makes no sense, for example, to speak of man in his world, though we often do, as primarily a spatial relation. The phrase match in a box does imply a spatial relation, but to speak of a man in his home or in his office or in a hotel at the seashore implies something radically different. A person's world cannot be comprehended by describing the environment, no matter how complex we make our description. As we shall see below, environment is only one mode of world, and the common tendencies to talk of a person in an environment or to ask what influence the environment has upon him are vast oversimplifications. Even from a biological viewpoint, von Uexküll holds, one is justified in assuming as many environments, Umwelten, as there are animals. There is not one space and time only, he goes on to say, but as many spaces and times as there are subjects. End quote. How much more would it not be true that the human being has his own world? Granted that this confronts us with no easy problem, for we cannot describe world in purely objective terms, nor is world to be limited to our subjective imaginative participation in the structure around us, although that too is part of being in the world. World is the structure of meaningful relationships in which a person exists and in the design of which he participates. Thus, world includes the past events which condition my existence and all the vast variety of deterministic influences which operate upon me. But it is these as I relate to them, am aware of them, carry them with me, molding, inevitably forming, building them in every minute of relating. For to be aware of one's world means at the same time to be designing it. World is not limited to the past determining events, but includes also all the possibilities which open up before any person and are not simply given in the historical situation. World is thus not to be identified with culture. It includes culture, but a good deal more, such as Eigenwelt, the own world which cannot be reduced merely to an introjection of the culture, as well as all the individual's future possibilities. One would get some idea, Schachtel writes, of the unimaginable richness and depth of the world and its possible meanings for man, if he knew all languages and cultures, not merely intellectually, but with his total personality. This would comprise the historically knowable world of man, but not the infinity of future possibilities." End quote. It is the openness of world which chiefly distinguishes man's world from the closed worlds of animals and plants. This does not deny the finiteness of life. We are all limited by death and old age and are subject to infirmities of every sort. The point, rather, is that these possibilities are given within the context of the contingency of existence. In a dynamic sense, indeed, these future possibilities are the most significant aspect of any human being's world, for they are the potentialities with which he builds or designs world, a phrase the existential therapists are fond of using. World is never something static, something merely given which the person then accepts or adjusts to or fights. It is rather a dynamic pattern which, so long as I possess self-consciousness, I am in the process of forming and designing. Thus Binswanger speaks of world as, quote, "that toward which the existence has climbed and according to which it has designed itself," end quote, and goes on to emphasize that whereas a tree or an animal is tied to its blueprint in relation to the environment, quote, "human existence not only contains numerous possibilities of modes of being, but is precisely rooted in this manifold potentiality of being," end quote. The important and very fruitful use the existential analysts make of analyzing the patient's world is shown in Roland Kuhn's study of Rudolf, the butcher boy who shot a prostitute. As Kuhn summarizes the facts in the case, quote, "On March 23, 1939, Rudolf R., a 21-year-old hard-working, inconspicuous butcher boy, having no police record, shot a prostitute with the intent to kill. He had left his job in the morning, donned his Sunday clothes, purchased a pistol and ammunition, and had gone to Zurich on a one-way ticket. There he roamed the streets all day, stopping at several taverns but without drinking much. At 5 p.m. he met a prostitute in a bar, accompanied her to her room, had intercourse with her, and, after they had both dressed again, fired the shot. She was hit by the bullet, but only slightly injured. Shortly after the criminal act, Rudolf surrendered to the police." End quote. Noting that Rudolf was in mourning in this period following the death of his father, Kuhn goes to considerable lengths to understand the world of the mourner. Rudolf had avoided and repressed the act of mourning for his mother who died when he was 4. He had lived since that age in a mourning world, that is, generally depressed and seemingly without any experiences of joy. After the death of his mother, he had slept in her bed for several years, seemed to be searching for her, or searching for the opportunity to experience the mourning and get it out of his system. Kuhn quotes Rilke, "Killing is one of the forms of our wandering mourning." The case is too complex as Kuhn describes it to summarize here, but at the conclusion of the study the reader is left with a completeness of understanding of Rudolf's world of the mourner and his attempted murder of the prostitute as an act of mourning for his mother. I do not believe that this clarity could be gained by any method other than such a description of the patient in his world. Chapter 9. The 3 modes of world. The existential analysts, as we have discovered, distinguish 3 modes of world, that is, 3 simultaneous aspects of world, which characterize the existence of each one of us as being in the world. First, there is Umwelt, literally meaning world around. This is the biological world, generally called in our day the environment. There is, second, the Mitwelt, literally the with world, the world of beings of one's own kind, the world of one's fellow men. The third is Eigenwelt, the own world, the world of relationship to oneself. The first, Umwelt, is what is taken in general parlance as world, namely the world of objects about us, the natural world. All organisms have an Umwelt. For animals and human beings, the Umwelt includes biological needs, drives, instincts, the world one would still exist in if, let us hypothesize, one had no self-consciousness. It is the world of natural law and natural cycles, of sleep and awakeness, of being born and dying, desire and relief, the world of finiteness and biological determinism, the throne world, into which each of us was hurled by our birth, and to which each of us must in some way adjust. The existential analysts do not at all neglect the reality of the natural world. Natural law is as valid as ever, as Kierkegaard put it. They have no truck with the idealists who would reduce the material world to an epiphenomenon, or with the intuitionists who would make it purely subjective, or with anyone who would underestimate the importance of the world of biological determinism. Indeed, their insistence on taking the objective world of nature seriously is one of their distinctive characteristics. In reading them, I often have the impression that they are able to grasp the Umwelt, the material world, with greater reality than those who segment it into drives and substances, precisely because they are not limited to Umwelt alone, but see it also in the context of human self-consciousness. Boss's understanding of the patient with the feces and church steeple dream cited above is an excellent example. They insist strongly that it is an oversimplification and radical error to deal with human beings as though Umwelt were the only mode of existence, or to carry over the categories which fit Umwelt to make a Procrustean bed upon which to force all human experience. In this connection, the existential analysts are more empirical, that is, more respectful of actual human phenomena than the mechanists or positivists or behaviorists. The Midwelt is the world of interrelationships with human beings. But it is not to be confused with the influence of the group upon the individual or the collective mind or the various forms of social determinism. The distinctive quality of Midwelt can be seen when we note the difference between a herd of animals and a community of people. Howard Liddell has pointed out that for his sheep, the herd instinct consists of keeping the environment constant, except in mating and suckling periods. A flock of collie dogs or children will do as well for the sheep providing such an environment is kept constant. In a group of human beings, however, a vastly more complex interaction goes on, with the meaning of the others in the group partly determined by one's own relationship to them. Strictly speaking, we should say animals have an environment, human beings have a world. For world includes the structure of meaning which is designed by the interrelationship of the persons in it. Thus, the meaning of the group for me depends in part upon how I put myself into it. And thus, also, love can never be understood on a purely biological level, but depends upon such factors as personal decision and commitment to the other person. The categories of adjustment and adaptation are entirely accurate in Umwelt. I adapt to the cold weather and I adjust to the periodic needs of my body for sleep. The critical point is that the weather is not changed by my adjusting to it, nor is it affected at all. Adjustment occurs between two objects, or a person and an object. But in Midwelt, the categories of adjustment and adaptation are not accurate. The term relationship offers the right category. If I insist that another person adjust to me, I am not taking him as a person, as Dasein, but as an instrumentality, and even if I adjust to myself, I am using myself as an object. One can never accurately speak of human beings as sexual objects. Once a person is a sexual object, you are not talking about a person anymore. The essence of relationship is that in the encounter both persons are changed. Providing the human beings involved are not too severely ill and have some degree of consciousness, relationship always involves mutual awareness, and this already is the process of being mutually affected by the encounter. The Eigenwelt, or own world, is the mode which is least adequately dealt with or understood in modern psychology and depth psychology. Indeed, it is fair to say that it is almost ignored. Eigenwelt presupposes self-awareness, self-relatedness, and is uniquely present in human beings. But it is not merely a subjective inner experience. It is rather the basis on which we see the real world in its true perspective, the basis on which we relate. It is a grasping of what something in the world, this bouquet of flowers, this other person, means to me. Suzuki has remarked that in Eastern languages, such as Japanese, adjectives always include the implication of for me-ness. That is to say, this flower is beautiful means for me this flower is beautiful. Our Western dichotomy between subject and object has led us, in contrast, to assume that we have said most if we state that the flower is beautiful entirely divorced from ourselves, as though a statement were the more true in proportion to how little we ourselves have to do with it. This leaving of Eigenwelt out of the picture not only contributes to arid intellectualism and loss of vitality, but also has much to do with the fact that modern people tend to lose the sense of reality of their experiences. It should be clear that these three modes of world are always interrelated and always condition each other. At every moment, for example, I exist in Umwelt, the biological world, but how I relate to my need for sleep or the weather or any instinct, how, that is, I see in my own self-awareness this or that aspect of Umwelt, is crucial for its meaning for me and conditions how I will react to it. The human being lives in Umwelt, Mitwelt, and Eigenwelt simultaneously. They are by no means three different worlds, but three simultaneous modes of being in the world. Several implications follow from the above description of the three modes of world. One is that the reality of being in the world is lost if one of these modes is emphasized to the exclusion of the other two. In this connection, Binswanger holds that classical psychoanalysis deals only with the Umwelt. The genius and the value of Freud's work lies in uncovering man in the Umwelt, the mode of instincts, drives, contingency, biological determinism. But traditional psychoanalysis has only a shadowy concept of Mitwelt, the mode of the interrelation of persons as subjects. One might argue that such psychoanalysis does have a Mitwelt, in the sense that individuals need to find each other for the sheer necessity of meeting biological needs, that libidinal drives require social outlets, and make social relationships necessary. But this is simply to derive Mitwelt from Umwelt, to make Mitwelt an epiphenomenon of Umwelt, and it means that we are not really dealing with Mitwelt at all, but only another form of Umwelt. It is clear that the interpersonal schools do have a theoretical basis for dealing directly with Mitwelt. This is shown, to take only one example, in Sullivan's interpersonal theory. Though they should not be identified, Mitwelt and interpersonal theory have a great deal in common. The danger at this point, however, is that if Eigenwelt in turn is omitted, interpersonal relations tend to become hollow and sterile. It is well known that Sullivan argued against the concept of the individual personality and made a great effort to determine the self in terms of reflected appraisal and social categories, i.e., the roles the person plays in the interpersonal world. Theoretically, this suffers from considerable logical inconsistency and indeed goes directly against other very important contributions of Sullivan. Practically, it tends to make the self a mirror of the group around one, to empty the self of vitality and originality, and to reduce the interpersonal world to mere social relations. It opens the way to the tendency which is directly opposed to the goals of Sullivan and other interpersonal thinkers, namely social conformity. Mitwelt does not automatically absorb either Umwelt or Eigenwelt. But when we turn to the mode of Eigenwelt itself, we find ourselves on the unexplored frontier of psychotherapeutic theory. What does it mean to say, the self in relation to itself? What goes on in the phenomena of consciousness, of self-awareness? What happens in insight when the inner gestalt of a person reforms itself? Indeed, what does the self-knowing itself mean? Each of these phenomena goes on almost every instant with all of us. They are indeed closer to us than our breathing. Yet, perhaps precisely because they are so near to us, no one knows what is happening in these events. This mode of the self in relation to itself was the aspect of experience which Freud never really saw, and it is doubtful whether any school has as yet achieved a basis for adequately dealing with it. Eigenwelt is certainly the hardest mode to grasp in the face of our Western technological preoccupations. It may well be that the mode of Eigenwelt will be the era in which most clarification will occur in the next decades. Another implication of this analysis of the modes of being in the world is that it gives us a basis for the psychological understanding of love. The human experience of love obviously cannot be adequately described within the confines of Umwelt. The interpersonal schools, at home chiefly in Midwelt, have dealt with love, particularly in Sullivan's concept of the meaning of the chum, and in Fromm's analysis of the difficulties of love in contemporary estranged society. But there is reason for doubting whether a theoretical foundation for going further is yet present in these or other schools. The same general caution given above is pertinent here, namely that without an adequate concept of Umwelt, love becomes empty of vitality, and without Eigenwelt, it lacks power and the capacity to fructify itself. In any case, Eigenwelt cannot be omitted in the understanding of love. Nietzsche and Kierkegaard continually insisted that to love presupposes that one has already become the true individual, the solitary one, the one who has comprehended the deep secret that also in loving another person, one must be sufficient unto oneself. They, like other existentialists, do not attain to love themselves, but they help perform the psychosurgical operations on 19th century man, which may clear blockages away and make love possible. By the same token, Binswanger and other existential therapists speak frequently of love. And though one could raise questions about how love is actually dealt with by them in given therapeutic cases, they nonetheless give us the theoretical groundwork for ultimately dealing with love adequately in psychotherapy. One feels in many of the psychological and psychiatric discussions of love in America a lack of the tragic dimension. Indeed, to take tragedy into the picture in any sense requires that the individual be understood in the three modes of world: the world of biological drive, fate, and determinism, Umwelt; the world of responsibility to fellow men, Mitwelt; and the world in which the individual can be aware, Eigenwelt, of the fate he alone at that moment is struggling with. The Eigenwelt is essential to any experience of tragedy, for the individual must be conscious of his own identity in the midst of the vast natural and social forces operating a destiny upon him. It has been rightly said that we lack a sense of tragedy in America, and hence produce few real tragedies in drama or other forms of art, because we lack the sense of the individual's own identity and consciousness. Chapter 10. Of Time and History. The next contribution of the existential analysts we shall consider is their distinctive approach to time. They are struck by the fact that the most profound human experiences, such as anxiety, depression, and joy, occur more in the dimension of time than in space. They boldly place time in the center of the psychological picture and proceed to study it not in the traditional way as an analogy to space, but in its own existential meaning for the patient. An example of the fresh light this new approach to time throws upon psychological problems is seen in an engaging case study by Eugene Minkowski. Coming to Paris after his psychiatric training, Minkowski was struck by the relevance of the time dimension, then being proclaimed by Bergson to the understanding of psychiatric patients. Minkowski lived with this patient. In his own words, quote, "In the year of 1922, a stroke of good luck, or, more exactly, life's vicissitudes, obliged me to spend 2 months as the personal physician of a patient. The patient, a man of 66 who presented a depressive psychosis and delusions of persecution, expressed thoughts of guilt and ruin. People looked oddly at him in the street. His servants were paid to spy on him and betray him. Every newspaper article was directed at him, and books had been printed solely against him and his family. I had the possibility of following him from day to day, not in a mental hospital or sanitarium, but in an ordinary environment. I was not only able to observe the patient, but also, at almost each instant, I had the possibility of comparing his psychic life and mine. It was like 2 melodies being played simultaneously. Although these 2 melodies are as unharmonious as possible, nevertheless a certain balance becomes established between the notes of the one and the other, and permits us to penetrate a bit more deeply into our patient's psyche. Where, exactly, is the discordance between his psyche and our own? We ask, what is a delusion? Is it really nothing but a disorder of perception and of judgment? This brings us back to our present problem, namely, where is the discordance between the patient's psyche and our own? When I arrived, he stated that his execution would certainly take place that night. In his terror, unable to sleep, he also kept me awake all that night. I comforted myself with the thought that, come the morning, he would see that all his fears had been in vain. However, the same scene was repeated the next day and the next, until after 3 or 4 days I had given up hope, whereas his attitude had not budged 1 iota. What had happened? It was simply that I, as a normal human being, had rapidly drawn from the observed facts my conclusions about the future. I now knew that he would continue to go on, day after day, swearing that he was to be tortured to death that night, and so he did, giving no thought to the present or the past. This carryover from past and present into the future was completely lacking in him. This reasoning indicated a profound disorder in his general attitude toward the future. That time which we normally integrate into a progressive whole was here split into isolated fragments." End quote. In this case, Minkowski points out that the patient could not relate to time, and that each day was a separate island with no past and no future. Traditionally, the therapist would reason simply that the patient cannot relate to the future, cannot temporize, because he has these delusions. Minkowski proposes the exact opposite. Could we not, he asks, on the contrary, suppose the more basic disorder is the distorted attitude toward the future, while the delusion is only one of its manifestations? End quote. Minkowski's original approach throws a beam of illumination on these dark, unexplored areas of time and introduces a new freedom from the limits and shackles of clinical thought, when bound only to traditional ways of thinking. As I was reading this case, a parallel to my own practice in psychotherapy came to mind. That is, I discovered with some surprise that if we can help the severely anxious or depressed patient to focus on some point in the future when he will be outside his anxiety or depression, the battle is half won. The essence of severe anxiety and depression is that it engulfs our whole selves. It feels, as Minkowski says, universal. But the class that the patient is teaching, which makes him so anxious, will be over, or the dreaded session with his boss will be past. What will he feel then? This focusing upon some point in time outside the depression or anxiety gives the patient a perspective, a view from on high, so to speak, and this may well break the chains of the anxiety or depression. The patient may then relax, and some hope creeps in. If we psychotherapists, in our preoccupation with the content of depression or anxiety, have forgotten the time dimension, certainly the poets, often nearer to the actual existential experiences than we, have not. In the famous lines, Shakespeare has his acutely depressed character Macbeth ponder not his crime, which would be the content dimension, but the time dimension. Quote, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in the petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools, the way to dusty death. End quote. This new approach to time begins with observing that the most crucial fact about existence is that it emerges. That is, it is always in the process of becoming, always developing in time, and is never to be defined as static points. The existential therapists propose a psychology literally of being, rather than is or has been, or fixed and organic categories. Though their concepts were worked out several decades ago, it is highly significant that experimental work in psychology, such as that by Maurer and Liddell, illustrates and bears out their conclusions. At the end of one of his most important papers, Maurer holds that time is the distinctive dimension of human personality, time binding, that is, the capacity to bring the past into the present as part of the total causal nexus in which living organisms act and react, together with the capacity to act in the light of the long-term future, is, quote, the essence of mind and personality alike, end quote. Liddell has shown that his sheep can keep time, anticipate punishment for about 15 minutes and his dogs for about half an hour, but a human being can bring the past of thousands of years ago into the present as data to guide his present actions. And he can likewise project himself in conscious imagination into the future not only for a quarter of an hour but for weeks and years and decades. This capacity to transcend the immediate boundaries of time, to see one's experience self-consciously in the light of the distant past and the future, to act and react in these dimensions, to learn from the past of 1,000 years ago and to mold the long-time future, is the unique characteristic of human existence. The existential therapists agree with Bergson that time is the heart of existence, and that our error has been to think of ourselves primarily in spatialized terms appropriate to res extensa, as though we were objects which could be located like substances at this spot or that. By this distortion we lose our genuine and real existential relation with ourselves, and indeed with other persons around us. As a consequence of this overemphasis on spatialized thinking, says Bergson, quote, the moments when we grasp ourselves are rare, and consequently we are seldom free. End quote. Or, when we have taken time into the picture, it has been, in the sense of Aristotle's definition, the dominant one in the tradition of Western thought, quote, for the time is this, what is counted in the movement in accordance with what is earlier and later. End quote. The striking thing about this description of clock time is that it really is an analogy from space, and one can best understand it by thinking in terms of a line of blocks or regularly spaced points on a clock or calendar. This approach to time is most fitting in the Umwelt, where we view the human being as an entity set among the various conditioning and determining forces of the natural world and acted upon by instinctual drives. But in the Midwelt, the mode of personal relations and love, quantitative time has much less to do with the significance of an occurrence. The nature or degree of one's love, for example, can never be measured by the number of years one has known the loved one. It is true that clock time has much to do with Midwelt. Many people sell their time on an hourly basis. The daily life runs on schedules. We refer rather to the inner meaning of the events. Quote, no clock strikes for the happy one, says a German proverb quoted by Strauss. Indeed, the most significant events in a person's psychological existence are likely to be precisely the ones which are immediate, breaking through the usual steady progression of time. Finally, the Eigenwelt, the own world of self-relatedness, self-awareness, and insight into the meaning of an event for oneself, has practically nothing whatever to do with Aristotle's clock time. The essence of self-awareness and insight are that they are there, instantaneous, immediate, and the moment of awareness has its significance for all time. One can see this easily by noting what happens in oneself at the instant of an insight or any experience of grasping oneself. The insight occurs with suddenness, is born whole, so to speak. And one will discover that, though meditating on the insight for an hour or so may reveal many of its further implications, the insight is not clearer, and disconcertingly enough, often not as clear at the end of the hour as it was at the beginning. The existential therapists also observed that the most profound psychological experiences are peculiarly those which shake the individual's relation to time. Severe anxiety and depression blot out time, annihilate the future, or, as Minkowski proposes, it may be that the disturbance of the patient in relation to time, his inability to have a future, gives rise to his anxiety and depression. In either case, the most painful aspect of the sufferer's predicament is that he is unable to imagine a future moment in time when he will be out of the anxiety or depression. We see a similar close interrelationship between the disturbance of the time function and neurotic symptoms. Repression and other processes of the blocking off of awareness are in essence methods of ensuring that the usual relation of past to present will not obtain. Since it would be too painful or in other ways too threatening for the individual to retain certain aspects of his past in his present consciousness, he must carry the past along like a foreign body in him, but not of him, as it were, an encapsulated fifth column, which thereupon compulsively drives to its outlets in neurotic symptoms. However one looks at it, the problem of time has a peculiar importance in understanding human existence. The reader may agree at this point, but feel that if we try to understand time in other than spatial categories, we are confronted with a mystery. He may well share the perplexity of Augustine, who wrote, quote, "When no one asks me what time is, I know, but when I would give an explanation of it in answer to a man's question, I do not know." End quote. One of the distinctive contributions of the existential analysts to this problem is that, having placed time in the center of the psychological picture, they then propose that the future, in contrast to present or past, is the dominant mode of time for human beings. Personality can be understood only as we see it on a trajectory toward its future. A man can understand himself only as he projects himself forward. This is a corollary of the fact that the person is always becoming, always emerging into the future. The self is to be seen in its potentiality. Quote, "A self, every instant it exists," Kierkegaard wrote, "is in process of becoming for the self, is only that which it is to become." End quote. The existentialists do not mean distant future or anything connected with using the future as an escape from the past or present. They mean only to indicate that the human being, so long as he possesses self-awareness and is not incapacitated by anxiety or neurotic rigidities, is always in a dynamic self-actualizing process, always exploring, molding himself, and moving into the immediate future. They do not neglect the past, but they hold it can be understood only in the light of the future. The past is the domain of Umwelt, of the contingent, natural, historical, deterministic forces operating upon us. But since we do not live exclusively in Umwelt, we are never merely the victims of automatic pressures from the past. The deterministic events of the past take their significance from the present and future. As Freud put it, we are anxious lest something happen in the future. Quote, "The word of the past is an oracle uttered," remarked Nietzsche. Quote, "Only as builders of the future, as knowing the present, will you understand it." End quote. All experience has a historical character, but the error is to treat the past in mechanical terms. The past is not the now which was, nor any collection of isolated events, nor a static reservoir of memories or past influences or impressions. The past, rather, is the domain of contingency in which we accept events and from which we select events in order to fulfill our potentialities and to gain satisfactions and security in the immediate future. This realm of the past, of natural history and thrownness, Binswanger points out, is the mode which classical psychoanalysis has, par excellence, made its own for exploration and study. But as soon as we consider the exploration of a patient's past in psychoanalysis, we note two very curious facts. First is the obvious phenomenon observed every day, that the events in the past which the patient remembers have very little, if any, necessary connection with the quantitative events that actually happened to him as a child. One single thing that occurred to him at a given age is remembered and thousands of things are forgotten. And even the events that occurred most frequently, like getting up in the morning, are most apt to leave no impression. Alfred Adler pointed out that memory is a creative process, that we remember what has significance for our style of life, and that the whole form of memory is, therefore, a mirror of the individual's style of life. What an individual seeks to become determines what he remembers of his has-been. In this sense, the future determines the past. The second fact is this: whether or not a patient can even recall the significant events of the past depends upon his decision with regard to the future. Every therapist knows that patients may bring up past memories ad interminum, without any memory ever moving them, the whole recital being flat, inconsequential, tedious. From an existential point of view, the problem is not at all that these patients happen to have endured impoverished pasts. It is rather that they cannot or do not commit themselves to the present and future. Their past does not become alive because nothing matters enough to them in the future. Some hope and commitment to work toward changing something in the immediate future, be it overcoming anxiety or other painful symptoms, or integrating oneself for further creativity, is necessary before any uncovering of the past will have reality. One practical implication of the above analysis of time is that psychotherapy cannot rest on the usual automatic doctrines of historical progress. The existential analysts take history very seriously, but they protest against any tendency to evade the immediate, anxiety-creating issues in the present by taking refuge behind the determinism of the past. They are against the doctrines that historical forces carry the individual along automatically, whether these doctrines take the form of the religious beliefs of predestination or providence, the deteriorated Marxist doctrine of historical materialism, the various psychological doctrines of determinism, or that most common form of such historical determinism in our society, faith in automatic technical progress. Kierkegaard was very emphatic on this point. Quote, "Whatever the one generation may learn from the other, that which is genuinely human no generation learns from the foregoing. Thus no generation has learned from another to love, no generation begins at any other point than at the beginning, no generation has a shorter task assigned to it than had the previous generation. In this respect, every generation begins primitively, has no different task from that of every previous generation, nor does it get further, except in so far as the preceding generation shirked its task and deluded itself." End quote. This implication is particularly relevant to psychotherapy, since the popular mind so often makes of psychoanalysis and other forms of psychotherapy the new technical authority which will take over for them the burden of learning to love. Since the popular mind so often makes of psychoanalysis and other forms of psychotherapy the new technical authority which will take over for them the burden of learning to love, obviously all any therapy can do is to help a person remove the blocks which keep him from loving. It cannot love for him, and it is doing him ultimate harm if it dulls his own responsible awareness at this point. A last contribution of this existential analysis of time lies in its understanding of the process of insight. Kierkegaard uses the engaging term Augenblick, literally meaning the blinking of an eye, and generally translated the pregnant moment. It is the moment when a person suddenly grasps the meaning of some important event in the past or future in the present. Its pregnancy consists of the fact that it is never an intellectual act alone. The grasping of the new meaning always presents the possibility and necessity of some personal decision, some shift in gestalt, some new orientation of the person toward the world and future. This is experienced by most people as the moment of most heightened awareness. It is referred to in psychological literature as the aha experience. On the philosophical level, Paul Tillich describes it as the moment when eternity touches time, for which moment he has developed the concept of kairos, time fulfilled. In religion and literature, this moment when eternity touches time is known as an epiphany. Chapter 11. Transcending the Immediate Situation. A final characteristic of man's existence, Dasein, which we shall discuss, is the capacity to transcend the immediate situation. If one tries to study the human being as a composite of substances, one does not need to deal with the disturbing fact that existence is always in process of self-transcending. But if we are to understand a given person as existing, dynamic, at every moment becoming, we cannot avoid this dimension. This capacity is already stated in the term exist, that is, to stand out from. Existing involves a continual emerging in the sense of emergent evolution, a transcending of one's past and present in terms of the future. Thus, transcender, literally to climb over or beyond, describes what every human being is engaged in doing every moment when he is not seriously ill or temporarily blocked by despair or anxiety. One can see this emergent evolution in all life processes. Nietzsche has Zarathustra proclaim, quote, "And this secret spake life herself to me. Behold, said she, I am that which must ever surpass itself." End quote. But it is much more radically true of human existence, where the capacity for self-awareness qualitatively increases the range of consciousness and, therefore, greatly enlarges the range of possibilities of transcending the immediate situation. The term transcending is open to much misunderstanding and indeed often calls forth violent antagonism. In this country, the term is relegated to vague and ethereal things which, as Bacon remarked, are better dealt with in, quote, poesy, where transcendences are more allowed, end quote, or associated with Kantian a priori assumptions, or with New England transcendentalism or religious otherworldliness, or with things unempirical and unrelated to actual experience. We mean something different from all of these. It has been suggested, furthermore, that the word has lost its usefulness and another should be found. That would be fine if another were available that would adequately describe the exceedingly important immediate human experience to which this term, when used by Goldstein and the existential writers, refers, for any adequate description of human beings requires that the experience be taken into account. Some suspicion of the term obviously is sound to the extent that the word can serve to elevate any given topic out of any immediate field in which it can be discussed and thus lead to obscurantism. And often in such cases the transcendent thing aimed at is given a capital letter such as self or wholeness, apparently to bootleg in some quality of divinity. It must be confessed that occasional usages of the term in existential literature have a similar effect, particularly when the transcendental categories of Husserl are assumed without explanation of how they apply. Other objections to the term, Less justifiable may arise from the fact that the capacity to transcend the present situation introduces a disturbing fourth dimension, a time dimension, and this is a serious threat to the traditional way of describing human beings in terms of static substances. The term is likewise rejected by those who seek to make no distinction between animal and human behavior or to understand human psychology in terms only of mechanical models. This capacity we are about to discuss does in actual fact present difficulties to those approaches since it is uniquely characteristic of human beings. The neurobiological base for this capacity is classically described by Kurt Goldstein. Goldstein found that his brain-injured patients, chiefly soldiers with portions of the frontal cortex shot away, had specifically lost the ability to abstract, to think in terms of the possible. They were tied to the immediate concrete situation in which they found themselves. When their closets happened to be in disarray, they were thrown into profound anxiety and disordered behavior. They exhibited compulsive orderliness, which is a way of holding oneself at every moment rigidly to the concrete situation. When asked to write their names on a sheet of paper, they would typically write in the very corner, any venture out from the specific boundaries of the edges of the paper representing too great a threat. It was as though they were threatened with dissolution of the self unless they remained related at every moment to the immediate situation, as though they could be a self only as the self was bound to the concrete items in space. Goldstein holds that the distinctive capacity of the normal human being is precisely this capacity to abstract, to use symbols, to orient oneself beyond the immediate limits of the given time and space, to think in terms of the possible. The injured or ill patients were characterized by loss of range of possibility. Their world space was shrunk, their time curtailed, and they suffered a consequent radical loss of freedom. The capacity of the normal human being to transcend the present situation is exemplified in all kinds of behavior. One is the capacity to transcend the boundaries of the present moment in time, as we pointed out in our discussion above, and to bring the distant past and the long-term future into one's immediate existence. It is also exemplified in the human being's unique capacity to think and talk in symbols. Reason and the use of symbols are rooted in the capacity to stand outside the particular object or sound at hand. Say these boards on which my typewriter sits, and the two syllables that make up the word table, and agreeing with each other that these will stand for a whole class of objects. The capacity is particularly shown in social relationships, in the normal person's relation to the community. Indeed, the whole fabric of trust and responsibility in human relations presupposes the capacity of the individual to see himself as others see him. As Robert Burns puts it in contrasting himself with the field mouse, to see himself as the one fulfilling his fellow men's expectations, acting for their welfare or failing to. Just as this capacity for transcending the situation is impaired with respect to the Umwelt in the brain injured, as we saw in Goldstein's patients, it is impaired with respect to the Mitwelt in the psychopathic disorders. These are the disorders of those in whom the capacity to see themselves as others see them is absent or does not carry sufficient weight, who are then said to lack conscience. The term conscience, significantly enough, is in many languages the same word as consciousness, both meaning to know with. Nietzsche remarked, quote, "Man is the animal who can make promises," end quote. By this he did not mean promises in the sense of social pressure or simply introjection of social requirement, which are oversimplified ways of describing conscience, errors which arise from conceiving of Mitwelt apart from Eigenwelt. Rather, he meant that an individual can be aware of the fact that he has given his word, can see himself as the one who makes the agreement. Thus, to make promises presupposes conscious self-relatedness, and is a very different thing from simple conditioned social behavior, acting in terms of the requirements of the group or herd or hive. In the same light, Sartre writes that dishonesty is a uniquely human form of behavior. Quote, "The lie is a behavior of transcendence." End quote. It is significant at this point to note the great number of terms used in describing human actions which contain the prefix responsible, recollect, relate, and so on. In the last analysis, all imply and rest upon this capacity to come back to oneself as the one performing the act. This is illustrated with special clarity in the peculiarly human capacity to be responsible, a word combining and spondere, promise, designating the one who can be depended upon, who can promise to give back, to answer. Erwin Strauss describes man as the questioning being, the organism who at the same moment that he exists can question himself and his own existence. Indeed, the whole existential approach is rooted in the always curious phenomenon that we have in man a being who not only can, but must, if he is to realize himself, question his own being. One can see at this point that the discussion of dynamisms of social adjustment, such as introjection, identification, and so forth, is oversimplified and inadequate when it omits the central fact of all, namely the person's capacity to be aware at the moment that he is the one responding to the social expectation, the one choosing or not choosing to guide himself according to a certain model. This is the distinction between rote social conformity on one hand and the freedom, originality, and creativity of genuine social response on the other. The latter are the unique mark of the human being acting in the light of the possible. Self-consciousness implies self-transcendence. The one has no reality without the other. It will have become apparent to many readers that the capacity to transcend the immediate situation uniquely presupposes Eigenwelt, that is, the mode of behavior in which a person sees himself as subject and object at once. The capacity to transcend the situation is an inseparable part of self-awareness, for it is obvious that the mere awareness of oneself as a being in the world implies the capacity to stand outside and look at oneself and the situation, and to assess and guide oneself by an infinite variety of possibilities. The existential analysts insist that the human being's capacity for transcending the immediate situation is discernible in the very center of human experience and cannot be sidestepped or overlooked without distorting and making unreal and vague one's picture of the person. This is particularly cogent and true with respect to data we encounter in psychotherapy. All of the peculiarly neurotic phenomena, such as the split of unconsciousness from consciousness, repression, blocking of awareness, self-deceit by way of symptoms, ad interminum, are misused, neurotic forms of the fundamental capacity of the human being to relate to himself and his world as subject and object at the same time. As Lawrence Kuby has written, quote, "The neurotic process is always a symbolic process, and the split into parallel yet interacting streams of conscious and unconscious processes starts approximately as the child begins to develop the rudiments of speech. It may be accurate to say, therefore, that the neurotic process is the price that we pay for our most precious human heritage, namely, our ability to represent experience and communicate our thoughts by means of symbols." End quote. The essence of the use of symbols, we have tried to show, is the capacity to transcend the immediate concrete situation. We can now see why Medard Boss and the other existential psychiatrists and psychologists make this capacity to transcend the immediate situation the basic and unique characteristic of human existence. Quote, "Transcendence and being in the world are names for the identical structure of Dasein, which is the foundation for every kind of attitude and behavior." End quote. Boss goes on in this connection to criticize Binswanger for speaking of different kinds of transcendences, the transcendence of love as well as the transcendence of care. This unnecessarily complicates the point, says Boss, and it makes no sense to speak of transcendences in the plural. We can only say, holds Boss, that man has the capacity for transcending the immediate situation because he has the capacity for sorge, that is, for care, or more accurately, for understanding his being and taking responsibility for it. The term sorge is from Heidegger and is basic to existential thought. It is used often in the form of Fürsorge, meaning care for, concerned for the welfare of. Sorge is for Boss the encompassing notion and includes love, hate, hope, and even indifference. All attitudes are ways of behaving in sorge or lack of it. In Boss's sense, the capacity of man to have sorge and to transcend the immediate situation are two aspects of the same thing. We need now to emphasize that this capacity to transcend the immediate situation is not a faculty to be listed along with other faculties. It is rather given in the ontological nature of being human. To abstract, to objectivate, are evidences of it, but, as Heidegger puts it, quote, transcendence does not consist of objectivation, but objectivation presupposes transcendence, end quote. That is to say, the fact that the human being can be self-related gives him, as one manifestation, the capacity to objectify his world, to think and talk in symbols, and so forth. This is Kierkegaard's point when he reminds us that to understand the self, we must see clearly that, quote, imagination is not one faculty on a par with others, but, if one would so speak, it is the faculty instar omnium, for all faculties. What feeling, knowledge, or will a man has depends in the last resort upon what imagination he has, that is to say, upon how these things are reflected. Imagination is the possibility of all reflection, and the intensity of this medium is the possibility of the intensity of the self. End quote. It remains to make more specific what is implicit above, namely, that this capacity for transcending the immediate situation is the basis of human freedom. The unique characteristic of the human being is the vast range of possibilities in any situation, which in turn depends upon his self-awareness, his capacity to run through in imagination the different ways of reacting in a given situation. Von Uexküll, in his metaphor of the forest, contrasts the different environments that creatures with different purposes find in the same forest. The insect in the tree has one environment, the romantic girl who walks in the forest has another, the woodsman who comes to chop down trees for firewood has another, the artist who comes to paint the forest has still another. Binswanger uses this metaphor to illustrate the variety of ways the human being can select among many self-world relationships. All of these depend upon our imagination-based possibilities of transcending, i.e., putting our own purposes upon the scene before us. In a variety of ways, the human being can select among many self-world relationships. The self is the capacity to see oneself in these many possibilities. This freedom with respect to world, Binswanger goes on to point out, is the mark of the psychologically healthy person. To be rigidly confined to a specific world, as was Ellen West, is the mark of psychological disorder. What is essential is freedom in designing world, or letting world occur, as Binswanger puts it. So deeply founded, he observes, is the essence of freedom as a necessity in existence that it can also dispense with existence itself. Chapter 12. Concerning Therapeutic Technique. Most of those who read works on existential analysis as handbooks of technique are bound to be disappointed. They will not find specifically developed practical methods. Many of the existential analysts are not greatly concerned with technical matters. The basic reason for the fact that these psychiatrists and psychologists are not so concerned with formulating technique, and make no apologies for this fact, is that existential analysis is a way of understanding human existence rather than a system of how-tos. Its representatives believe that one of the chief, if not the chief, blocks to the understanding of human beings in Western culture is precisely the overemphasis on technique, an overemphasis that goes along with the tendency to see the human being as an object to be calculated, managed, analyzed. Our Western tendency has been to believe that understanding follows technique. If we get the right technique, then we can penetrate the riddle of the patient, or, as said popularly with amazing perspicacity, we can get the other person's number. The existential approach holds the exact opposite, namely that technique follows understanding. The central task and responsibility of the therapist is to seek to understand the patient as a being and as being in his world. All technical problems are subordinate to this understanding. Without this understanding, technical facility is at best irrelevant, at worst a method of structuralizing the neurosis. With it, the groundwork is laid for the therapist's being able to help the patient recognize and experience his own existence, and this is the central process of therapy. This does not derogate disciplined technique, it rather puts it into perspective. It is clear at the outset that what distinguishes existential therapy is not what the therapist would specifically do, let us say, in meeting anxiety or confronting resistance or getting the life history and so forth, but rather the context of his therapy. How an existential therapist might interpret a given dream or an outburst of temper on the patient's part might not differ from what a classical psychoanalyst might say, if each were taken in isolated fashion. But the context of existential therapy would be very distinct. It would always focus on the questions of how this dream throws light on this particular patient's existence in his world, what it says about where he is at the moment and what he is moving toward, and so forth. The context is the patient not as a set of psychic dynamisms or mechanisms, but as a human being who is choosing, committing, and pointing himself towards something right now. The context is dynamic, immediately real, and present. I shall try to block out some implications concerning therapeutic technique from my knowledge of the works of the existential therapists and from my own experience of how their emphases have contributed to me, a therapist trained in psychoanalysis in its broad sense. Making a systematic summary would be presumptuous to try and impossible to accomplish, but I hope the following points will at least suggest some of the important therapeutic implications. It should be clear at every point, however, that the really important contributions of this approach are its deepened understanding of human existence, and one gets no place talking about isolated techniques of therapy unless the understanding we have sought to give in the earlier portions of these chapters is presupposed at every point. The first implication is the variability of techniques among the existential therapists. Boss, for example, uses couch and free association in traditional Freudian manner and permits a good deal of acting out of transference. Others would vary as much as the different schools vary anyway. But the critical point is that the existential therapists have a definite reason for using any given technique with a given patient. They sharply question the use of technique simply because of rote, custom, or tradition. Their approach also does not at all settle for the air of vagueness and unreality that surrounds many therapeutic sessions, particularly in the eclectic schools which allegedly have freed themselves from bondage to a traditional technique and select from all schools as though the presuppositions of these approaches did not matter. Existential therapy is distinguished by a sense of reality and concreteness. I would phrase the above point positively as follows. Existential technique should have flexibility and versatility, varying from patient to patient and from one phase to another in treatment with the same patient. The specific technique to be used at a given point should be decided on the basis of these questions. What will best reveal the existence of this particular patient at this moment in his history? What will best illuminate his being in the world? Never merely eclectic, this flexibility always involves a clear understanding of the underlying assumptions of any method. Let us say a Kinseyite, for example, a traditional Freudian, and an existential analyst are dealing with an instance of sexual repression. The Kinseyite would speak of it in terms of finding a sexual object, in which case he is not talking about sex in human beings. The traditional Freudian would see its psychological implications, but would look primarily for causes in the past and might well ask how this instance of sexual repression, qua repression, can be overcome. The existential therapist would view the sexual repression as a holding back of potentia of the existence of this person, and though he might or might not, depending on the circumstances, deal immediately with the sex problem as such, it would always be seen not as a mechanism of repression as such, but as a limitation of this person's being in the world. The second implication is that psychological dynamisms always take their meaning from the existential situation of the patient's own immediate life. The writings of a number of existential psychotherapists, including Vandenberg, Frankl, Boss, and especially the work of R.J. Lang, are pertinent. Some hold that Freud's practice was right, but his theories explaining his practice were wrong. Some are Freudian in technique, but put the theories and concepts of orthodox psychoanalysis on a fundamental existential basis. Take transference, for example, a discovery which many greatly value. What really happens is not that the neurotic patient transfers feelings he had toward mother or father to wife or therapist. Rather, the neurotic is one who in certain areas never developed beyond the limited and restricted forms of experience characteristic of the infant. Hence, in later years, he perceives wife or therapist through the same restricted, distorted spectacles as he perceived father or mother. The problem is to be understood in terms of perception and relatedness to the world. This makes unnecessary the concept of transference in the sense of a displacement of detachable feelings from one object to another. The new basis of this concept frees psychoanalysis from the burden of a number of insoluble problems. Take also the ways of behaving known as repression and resistance. Freud saw repression as related to bourgeois morality, specifically as the patient's need to preserve an acceptable picture of himself and, therefore, to hold back thoughts, desires, and so forth which are unacceptable according to bourgeois moral codes. Existential therapists see the conflict more basically in the area of the patient's acceptance or rejection of his own potentialities. We need to keep in mind the question, what keeps the patient from accepting in freedom his potentialities? This may involve bourgeois morality, but it also involves a lot more. It leads immediately to the existential question of the person's freedom. Before repression is possible or conceivable, the person must have some possibility of accepting or rejecting, that is, some margin of freedom. Whether the person is aware of this freedom or can articulate it is another question. He does not need to be. To repress is precisely to make oneself unaware of freedom. This is the nature of the dynamism. Thus, to repress or deny this freedom already presupposes it as a possibility. We wish to emphasize that psychic determinism is always a secondary phenomenon and works only in a limited area. The primary question is how the person relates to his freedom to express potentialities in the first place, repression being one way of so relating. With respect to resistance, the question is to be asked, what makes such a phenomenon possible? One answers that it is an outworking of the tendency of the patient to become absorbed in the Mitwelt, to slip back into das Man, the anonymous mass, and to renounce the particular, unique, and original potentiality which is his. Thus, social conformity is a general form of resistance in life, and even the patient's acceptance of the doctrines and interpretations of the therapist may itself be an expression of resistance. We do not wish here to go into the question of what underlies these phenomena. We want only to demonstrate that at each point in considering these dynamisms of transference, resistance, and repression, these therapists do something important for the existential approach. They see dynamism on an ontological basis. Each way of behaving is seen and understood in the light of the existence of the patient as a human being. This is shown, too, in the therapist's conceiving of drives, libido, and so forth, always in terms of potentialities for existence. Boss thereby seeks, quote, to throw overboard the painful intellectual acrobatic of the old psychoanalytic theory which sought to derive the phenomena from the interplay of some forces or drives behind them, end quote. He does not deny forces as such, but holds that they cannot be understood as energy transformation, or on any other such natural science model, but only as the person's potentia of existence. Quote, this freeing from unnecessary constructions facilitates the understanding between patient and doctor. Also, it makes the pseudo-resistances disappear, which were a justified defense of the analysans against a violation of their essence. End quote. Boss holds that he thus can follow the basic rule in analysis, the one condition Freud set for analysis, namely, that the patient give forth in complete honesty whatever is going on in his mind, more effectively than in traditional psychoanalysis, for he listens with respect and takes seriously and without reserve the contents of the patient's communication, rather than sieving it through prejudgments or destroying it by special interpretations. Boss holds he is simply engaged in bringing out the underlying meaning of Freud's discoveries and placing them on their necessary comprehensive foundation. Believing that Freud's discoveries have to be understood below their faculty formulation, Boss points out that Freud himself was not merely a passive mirror for the patient in analysis, as traditionally urged in psychoanalysis, but was translucent, a vehicle and medium through which the patient sees himself. The third implication in existential therapy is the emphasis on presence. By this, we mean that the relationship of the therapist and patient is taken as a real one, the therapist being not merely a shadowy reflector, but an alive human being who happens, at that hour, to be concerned not with his own problems, but with understanding and experiencing as far as possible the being of the patient. The way was prepared for this emphasis on presence by our discussion above of the fundamental existential idea of truth in relationship. It was there pointed out that existentially truth always involves the relation of the person to something or someone, and that the therapist is part of the patient's relationship field. We indicated, too, that this was not only the therapist's best avenue to understanding the patient, but that he cannot really see the patient unless he participates in the field. Several quotations will make clearer what this presence means. Karl Jaspers has remarked, quote, what we are missing, what opportunities of understanding we let pass by because at a single decisive moment we were, with all our knowledge, lacking in the simple virtue of a full human presence. End quote. In similar vein, but greater detail, Binswanger writes in his paper on psychotherapy concerning the significance of the therapist's role in the relationship. Quote, if such a psychoanalytic treatment fails, the analyst inclines to assume that the patient is not capable of overcoming his resistance to the physician, for example, as a father image. Whether an analysis can have success or not is often, however, not decided by whether a patient is capable at all of overcoming such a transferred father image, but by the opportunity this particular physician accords him to do so. It may, in other words, be the rejection of the therapist as a person, the impossibility of entering into a genuine communicative rapport with him, that may form the obstacle against breaking through the eternal repetition of the father resistance. Caught in the mechanism, and thus in what inheres in it, mechanical repetition, the psychoanalytic doctrine, as we know, is altogether strangely blind toward the entire category of the new, the properly creative, in the life of the psyche everywhere. Certainly, it not always is true to the facts if one attributes the failure of treatment only to the patient. The question always to be asked first by the physician is whether the fault may not be his. What is meant here is not any technical fault, but the far more fundamental failure that consists of an impotence to wake or rekindle that divine spark in the patient which only true communication from existence to existence can bring forth, and which alone possesses, with its light and warmth, also the fundamental power that makes any therapy work. The power to liberate a person from the blind isolation, the idios cosmos of Heraclitus, from a mere vegetating in his body, his dreams, his private wishes, his conceit, and his presumptions, and to ready him for a life of koinonia, of genuine community." End quote. Presence is not to be confused with a sentimental attitude toward the patient, but depends firmly and consistently on how the therapist conceives of human beings. It is found in therapists of various schools and differing beliefs, differing, that is, on anything except one central issue, their assumptions about whether the human being is an object to be analyzed or a being to be understood. Any therapist is existential to the extent that, with all his technical training and his knowledge of transference and dynamisms, he is still able to relate to the patient as one existence communicating with another, to use Binswanger's phrase. In my own experience, Frieda Fromm-Reichmann particularly had this power in a given therapeutic hour. She used to say, "The patient needs an experience, not an explanation." Erich Fromm, for example, not only emphasizes presence in a way similar to Jasper's statement above, but makes it a central point in his teaching of psychoanalysis. Carl Rogers is an illustration of one who, never having had, so far as I know, direct contact with the existential therapists as such, has written a very existential document in his Apologia pro vita sua as a therapist. Quote, "I launch myself into the therapeutic relationship having a hypothesis, or a faith, that my liking, my confidence, and my understanding of the other person's inner world will lead to a significant process of becoming. I enter the relationship not as a scientist, not as a physician who can accurately diagnose and cure, but as a person, entering into a personal relationship. Insofar as I see him only as an object, the client will tend to become only an object. I risk myself, because if, as the relationship deepens, what develops is a failure, a regression, a repudiation of me and the relationship by the client, then I sense that I will lose myself, or a part of myself. At times this risk is very real, and is very keenly experienced. I let myself go into the immediacy of the relationship where it is my total organism which takes over and is sensitive to the relationship, not simply my consciousness. I am not consciously responding in a planful or analytic way, but simply in an unreflective way to the other individual, my reaction being based, but not consciously, on my total organismic sensitivity to this other person. I live the relationship on this basis." End quote. There are real differences between Rogers and the existential therapists, such as the fact that most of his work is based on relatively shorter time therapeutic relationships, whereas the work of the existential therapists in this volume is generally long time. Rogers' viewpoint is at times naively optimistic, whereas the existential approach is oriented more to the tragic crises of life and so forth. What are significant, however, are Rogers' basic ideas that therapy is a process of becoming, that the freedom and inner growth of the individual are what counts, and the implicit assumption pervading Rogers' work of the dignity of the human being. These concepts are all very close to the existentialist approach to the human being. Before leaving the topic of presence, we need to make 3 caveats. One is that this emphasis on relationship is in no way an oversimplification or shortcut. It is not a substitute for discipline or thoroughness of training. It rather puts these things in their context, namely discipline and thoroughness of training directed to understanding human beings as human. The therapist is assumedly an expert, but if he is not first of all a human being, his expertness will be irrelevant and possibly harmful. The distinctive character of the existential approach is that understanding being human is no longer just a gift, an intuition, or something left to chance. It is the proper study of man, in Alexander Pope's phrase, and becomes the center of a thorough and scientific concern in the broad sense. The existential analysts do the same thing with the structure of human existence that Freud did with the structure of the unconscious. Namely, they take it out of the realm of the hit-and-miss gift of special intuitive individuals, accept it as the area of exploration and understanding, and make it to some extent teachable. Another caveat is that the emphasis on the reality of presence does not obviate the exceedingly significant truths in Freud's concept of transference, rightly understood. It is demonstrable every day in the week that patients and all of us to some extent behave toward therapist or wife or husband as though they were father or mother or someone else, and the working through of this is of crucial importance. But in existential therapy, transference gets placed in the new context of an event occurring in a real relationship between two people. Almost everything the patient does vis-a-vis the therapist in a given hour has an element of transference in it. But nothing is ever just transference, to be explained to the patient as one would an arithmetic problem. The concept of transference as such has often been used as a convenient protective screen behind which both therapist and patient hide in order to avoid the more anxiety-creating situation of direct confrontation. For me to tell myself, say when especially fatigued, that the patient is so demanding because she wants to prove she can make her father love her may be a relief and may also be in fact true. But the real point is that she is doing this to me in this given moment, and the reasons it occurs at this instant of intersection of her existence and mine are not exhausted by what she did with her father. Beyond all considerations of unconscious determinism, which are true in their partial context, she is at some point choosing to do this at this specific moment. Furthermore, the only thing that will grasp the patient, and in the long run make it possible for her to change, is to experience fully and deeply that she is doing precisely this to a real person, myself, in this real moment. Part of the sense of timing in therapy, which has received special development among the existential therapists, consists of letting the patient experience what he or she is doing until the experience really grasps him or her. Then and only then will an explanation of why help. For the patient referred to above to become aware that she is demanding this particular unconditioned love from this real person in this immediate hour may indeed shock her, and thereafter, or possibly only hours later, she should become aware of the early childhood antecedents. She may well explore and re-experience then how she smoldered with anger as a child because she couldn't make her father notice her. But if she is simply told this is a transference phenomenon, she may have learned an interesting intellectual fact which does not existentially grasp her at all. Another caveat is that presence in a session does not at all mean the therapist imposes himself or his ideas or feelings on the patient. It is a highly interesting proof of our point that Rogers, who gives such a vivid picture of presence in the quotation above, is precisely the psychologist who has most unqualifiedly insisted that the therapist not project himself, but at every point follow the affect and leads of the patient. Being alive in the relationship does not at all mean the therapist will chatter along with the patient. He will know that patients have an infinite number of ways of trying to become involved with the therapist in order to avoid their own problems. And the therapist may well be silent, aware that to be a projective screen is one aspect of his part of the relationship. The therapist is what Socrates named the midwife, completely real in being there, but being there with the specific purpose of helping the other person to bring to birth something from within himself. The fourth implication for technique in existential analysis follows immediately from our discussion of presence. Therapy will attempt to analyze out the ways of behaving which destroy presence. The therapist, on his part, will need to be aware of whatever in him blocks full presence. I do not know the context of Freud's remark that he preferred that patients lie on the couch because he could not stand to be stared at for 9 hours a day, but it is obviously true that any therapist, whose task is arduous and taxing at best, is tempted at many points to evade the anxiety and potential discomfort of confrontation by various devices. We have earlier described the fact that real confrontation between two people can be profoundly anxiety-creating. Thus, it is not surprising that it is much more comfortable to protect ourselves by thinking of the other only as a patient, or focusing only on certain mechanisms of behavior. The technical view of the other person is perhaps the therapist's most handy anxiety-reducing device. This has its legitimate place. The therapist is presumably an expert, but technique must not be used as a way of blocking existence. Whenever the therapist finds himself reacting in a rigid or pre-formulated way, he had obviously best ask himself whether he is not trying to avoid some anxiety and as a result is losing something existentially real in the relationship. The therapist's situation is like that of the artist who has spent many years of disciplined study learning technique, but he knows that if specific thoughts of technique preoccupy him when he actually is in the process of painting, he has at that moment lost his vision. The creative process, which should absorb him, transcending the subject-object split, has become temporarily broken. He is now dealing with objects and himself as a manipulator of objects. The fifth implication has to do with the goal of the therapeutic process. The aim of therapy is that the patient experience his existence as real. The purpose is that he become aware of his existence as fully as possible, which includes becoming aware of his potentialities and becoming able to act on the basis of them. The characteristic of the neurotic is that his existence has become darkened, as the existential analysts put it, blurred, easily threatened and clouded over, and gives no sanction to his acts. The task of therapy is to illuminate the existence. The neurotic is overconcerned about the Umwelt and underconcerned about Eigenwelt. As the Eigenwelt becomes real to him in therapy, the patient tends to experience the Eigenwelt of the therapist as stronger than his own. Binswanger points out that the tendency to take over the therapist's Eigenwelt must be guarded against, and therapy must not become a power struggle between the two Eigenwelten. The therapist's function is to be there, with all of the connotation of Dasein, present in the relationship, while the patient finds and learns to live out his own Eigenwelt. An experience of my own may serve to illustrate one way of taking the patient existentially. I often have found myself having the impulse to ask, when the patient comes in and sits down, not "how are you?" but "where are you?" The contrast of these questions, neither of which would I probably actually ask aloud, highlights what is sought. I want to know, as I experience the patient in this hour, not just how he feels, but rather where he is. The where, including his feelings, but also a lot more. Whether he is detached or fully present. Whether his direction is toward me and toward his problems, or away from both. Whether he is running from anxiety. Whether his special courtesy when he came in, or appearance of eagerness to reveal things, is really inviting me to overlook some evasion he is about to make. Where he is in relation to the girlfriend he talked about yesterday, and so on. I became aware of this asking where the patient was before I specifically knew the work of the existential therapists. It illustrates a spontaneous existential attitude. It follows that when mechanisms or dynamisms are interpreted, as they will be in existential therapy as in any other, it will always be in the context of this person's becoming aware of his existence. This is the only way the dynamism will have reality for the patient, will affect him. Otherwise, he might as well, as indeed most patients do these days, read about the mechanism in a book. This point is of special importance because precisely the problem of many patients is that they think and talk about themselves in terms of mechanisms. It is their way, as well-taught citizens of 20th century Western culture, to avoid confronting their own existence, their method of repressing ontological awareness. This is done, to be sure, under the rubric of being objective about oneself. But is it not, in therapy as well as in life, often a systematized, culturally acceptable way of rationalizing detachment from oneself? Even the motive for coming for therapy may be just that, to find an acceptable system by which one can continue to think of oneself as a mechanism, to run oneself as one would a motor car, only now to do it successfully. If we assume, as we have reason for doing, that the fundamental neurotic process in our day is the repression of the ontological sense, the loss of the sense of being, together with the truncation of awareness and the locking up of the potentialities which are the manifestations of this being, then we are playing directly into the patient's neurosis to the extent that we teach him new ways of thinking of himself as a mechanism. This is one illustration of how psychotherapy can reflect the fragmentation of the culture, structuralizing neurosis rather than curing it. Trying to help the patient with a sexual problem by explaining it merely as a mechanism is like teaching a farmer irrigation while damming up his streams of water. This raises some penetrating questions about the nature of cure in psychotherapy. It implies that it is not the therapist's function to cure the patient's neurotic symptoms, though this is the motive for which most people come for therapy. Indeed, the fact that this is their motive reflects their problem. Therapy is concerned with something more fundamental, namely helping the person experience his existence, and any cure of symptoms which will last must be a byproduct of that. The general idea of cure, namely to become as satisfactorily adjusted as possible, is itself a denial of Dasein, of this particular patient's being. The kind of cure that consists of adjustment, becoming able to fit the culture, can be obtained by technical emphases in therapy, for it is precisely the central theme of the culture that one live in a calculated, controlled, technically well-managed way. Then the patient accepts a confined world without conflict, for now his world is identical with the culture. And since anxiety comes only with freedom, the patient naturally gets over his anxiety. He is relieved from his symptoms because he surrenders the possibilities which caused his anxiety. This is the way of being cured, by giving up being, giving up existence, by constricting, hedging in existence. In this respect, psychotherapists become the agents of the culture whose particular task it is to adjust people to it. Psychotherapy becomes an expression of the fragmentation of the period rather than an enterprise for overcoming it. As we have indicated above, there are clear historical indications that this is occurring in the different psychotherapeutic schools, and the historical probability is that it will increase. There is certainly a question how far this gaining of release from conflict by giving up one's being can proceed without generating in individuals and groups a submerged despair, a resentment, which will later burst out in self-destructiveness, for history proclaims again and again that sooner or later man's need to be free will out. But the complicating factor in our immediate historical situation is that the culture itself is built around this ideal of technical adjustments and carries so many built-in devices for narcotizing the despair that come from using oneself as a machine that the damaging effects may remain submerged for some time. On the other hand, the term cure can be given a deeper and truer meaning, namely, becoming oriented toward the fulfillment of one's existence. This may well include as a byproduct the cure of symptoms, obviously a desideratum, even if we have stated decisively that it is not the chief goal of therapy. The important thing is that the person discovers his being, his Dasein. The sixth implication which distinguishes the process of existential therapy is the importance of commitment. The basis for this was prepared at numerous points in our previous sections, particularly in our discussion of Kierkegaard's idea that truth exists only as the individual himself produces it in action. The significance of commitment is not that it is simply a vaguely good thing or ethically to be advised. It is a necessary prerequisite for seeing truth. This involves a crucial point which has never to my knowledge been fully taken into account in writings on psychotherapy, namely that decision precedes knowledge. We have worked normally on the assumption that as the patient gets more and more knowledge and insight about himself, he will make the appropriate decisions. This is a half-truth. The second half of the truth is generally overlooked, namely, that the patient cannot permit himself to get insight or knowledge until he is ready to decide, until he takes a decisive orientation to life and has made the preliminary decisions along the way. We mean decision here not in the sense of a be-all and end-all jump, say to get married or to join the Foreign Legion. The possibility or readiness to take such leaps is a necessary condition for the decisive orientation, but the big leap itself is sound only so far as it is based upon the minute decisions along the way. Otherwise, the sudden decision is the product of unconscious processes, proceeding compulsively in unawareness to the point where they erupt, for example, in a conversion. We use the term decision as meaning a decisive attitude toward existence, an attitude of commitment. In this respect, knowledge and insight follow decision rather than vice versa. Everyone knows of the incidents in which a patient becomes aware in a dream that a certain boss is exploiting him and the next day decides to quit his job. But just as significant, though not generally taken into account because they go against our usual ideas of causality, are the incidents when the patient cannot have the dream until he makes the decision. He makes the jump to quit his job, for example, and then he can permit himself to see in dreams that his boss was exploiting him all along. One interesting corollary of this point is seen when we note that a patient cannot recall what was vital and significant in his past until he is ready to make a decision with regard to the future. Memory works not on a basis simply of what is there imprinted. It works on the basis of one's decisions in the present and future. It is often said that one's past determines one's present and future. Let it be underlined that one's present and future, how he commits himself to existence at the moment, also determines his past. That is, it determines what he can recall of his past, what portions of his past he selects, consciously but also unconsciously, to influence him now, and therefore the particular gestalt his past will assume. This commitment is, furthermore, not a purely conscious or voluntaristic phenomenon. It is also present on so-called unconscious levels. When a person lacks commitment, for example, his dreams may be staid, flat, impoverished. But when he does assume a decisive orientation toward himself and his life, his dreams often take over the creative process of exploring, molding, forming himself in relation to his future, or, what is the same thing from the neurotic viewpoint, the dreams struggle to evade, substitute, cover up. The important point is that either way the issue has been joined. With respect to helping the patient develop the orientation of commitment, we should first emphasize that the existential therapists do not at all mean activism. This is no decision as a shortcut, no matter of premature jumping, because to act may be easier and may quiet anxiety more quickly than the slow, arduous, long-time process of self-exploration. They mean rather the attitude of Dasein, the self-aware being taking his own existence seriously. The points of commitment and decision are those where the dichotomy between being subject and object is overcome in the unity of readiness for action. When a patient discusses intellectually ad interminum a given topic without its ever shaking him or becoming real to him, the therapist asks, what is he doing existentially by means of this talk? The talk itself may well be in the service of covering up reality, rationalized generally under the idea of unprejudiced inquiry into the data. It is customarily said that the patient will break through such talk when some experience of anxiety, some inner suffering or outer threat shocks him into committing himself really to getting help and gives him the incentive necessary for the painful process of uncovering illusions, of inner change and growth. True, this does occur from time to time. and the existential therapist can aid the patient in absorbing the real impact of such experiences by helping him develop the capacity for silence, which is another form of communication, and thus avoid using chatter to break the shocking power of the encounter with the insight. But in principle, I do not think the conclusion that we must wait around until anxiety is aroused is adequate. If we assume that the patient's commitment depends upon being pushed by external or internal pain, we are in several difficult dilemmas. Either the therapy marks time until anxiety or pain occurs, or we arouse anxiety ourselves, which is a questionable procedure, and the very reassurance and quieting of anxiety the patient receives in therapy may work against his commitment to further help and may make for postponement and procrastination. Commitment must be on a more positive basis. The question we need to ask is, what is going on that the patient has not found some point in his own existence to which he can commit himself unconditionally? In the earlier discussion of non-being and death, it was pointed out that everyone constantly faces the threat of non-being if he lets himself recognize the fact. Central here is the symbol of death, but such threat of destruction of being is present in 1,001 other guises as well. The therapist is doing the patient a disservice if he takes away from him the realization that it is entirely within the realm of possibility that he forfeit or lose his existence, and that may well be precisely what he is doing at this very moment. The point is especially important because patients tend to carry a never quite articulated belief, no doubt connected with childhood omnipotent beliefs associated with parents, that somehow the therapist will see that nothing harmful happens to them and therefore they don't need to take their own existence seriously. The tendency prevails in much therapy to water down anxiety, despair, and the tragic aspects of life. Is it not true as a general principle that we need to engender anxiety only to the extent that we already have watered it down? Life itself produces enough, and the only real crises, and it is very much to the credit of the existential emphasis in therapy that it confronts these tragic realities directly. The patient can indeed destroy himself if he so chooses. The therapist may not say this, it is simply a reflection of fact, and the important point is that it not be sloughed over. The symbol of suicide as a possibility has a far-reaching positive value. Nietzsche once remarked that the thought of suicide has saved many lives. I am doubtful whether anyone takes his life with full seriousness until he realizes that it is entirely within his power to commit suicide. Death in any of its aspects is the fact which makes of the present hour something of absolute value. One student put it, quote, "I know only two things. One, that I will be dead someday. Two, that I am not dead now. The only question is what shall I do between those 2 points?" End quote. We cannot go into this matter in further detail, but we only wish to emphasize that the core of the existential approach is the taking of existence seriously. We conclude with 2 final caveats. One is a danger that lies in the existential approach, the danger of generality. It would indeed be a pity if the existential concepts were tossed around among therapists without regard for their concrete, real meaning. For it must be admitted that there is temptation to become lost in words in these complex areas with which existential analysis deals. One can certainly become philosophically detached in the same way as one can be technically detached. The temptation to use existential concepts in the service of intellectualizing tendencies is especially to be guarded against since, because they refer to things that have to do with the center of personal reality, these concepts can the more seductively give the illusion of dealing with reality. Some readers may feel that I have not fully resisted this temptation. I could plead the necessity of having to explain a great deal within a short compass, but extenuating circumstances are not the point. The point is that to the extent that the existential movement in psychotherapy becomes influential in this country, a desideratum which we believe would be very beneficial, the adherents will have to be on guard against the use of the concepts in the service of intellectual detachment. It is precisely for the above reasons that the existential therapists pay much attention to making clear the verbal utterances of the patient, and they also continually make certain that the necessary interrelation of verbalizing and acting is never overlooked. The logos must be made flesh. The important thing is to be existential. The other caveat has to do with the existential attitude toward the unconscious. In principle, most existential analysts deny this concept. They point out all the logical as well as psychological difficulties with the doctrine of the unconscious, and they stand against splitting the being into parts. What is called unconscious, they hold, is still part of this given person. Being, in any living sense, is at its core indivisible. Now it must be admitted that the doctrine of the unconscious has played most notoriously into the contemporary tendencies to rationalize behavior, to avoid the reality of one's own existence, to act as though one were not himself doing the living. The man in the street who has picked up the lingo says, "My unconscious did it." The existential analysts are correct, in my judgment, in their criticism of the doctrine of the unconscious as a convenient blank check on which any causal explanation can be given, on which any causal explanation can be written, or as a reservoir from which any deterministic theory could be drawn. But this is the Seller view of the unconscious, and objections to it should not be permitted to cancel out the great contribution that the historical meaning of the unconscious had in Freud's terms. Freud's great discovery and his perdurable contribution was to enlarge the sphere of the human personality beyond the immediate voluntarism and rationalism of Victorian man to include in this enlarged sphere the depths, that is, the irrational, the so-called repressed, hostile, and unacceptable urges, the forgotten aspects of experience, ad infinitum. The symbol for this vast enlarging of the domain of the personality was the unconscious. I do not wish to enter into the complex discussion of this concept of the unconscious itself. I wish only to suggest a position. It is right that the blank check deteriorated Seller form of this concept should be rejected, but the far-reaching enlargement of personality, which is its real meaning of the concept of the unconscious, should not be lost. Binswanger remarks that, for the time being, the existential therapists will not be able to dispense with the concept of the unconscious. I would propose, rather, that being is indivisible, that unconsciousness is part of any given being, that the Seller theory of the unconscious is logically wrong and practically unconstructive, but that the meaning of the discovery, namely, the radical enlargement of being, is one of the great contributions of our day and must be retained.